Hello everyone, I am the Creep's Cabin. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I was home alone with my grandmother, which had become a familiar routine. It wasn't that I didn't love her or that I didn't want to be there. It was just exhausting, and I hadn't had a moment to myself in months. My mother and aunt had thrown a dinner for Easter, and after the food was served and the dishes piled up, they both left to go out, leaving me with my Nana. She'd had a serious stroke a few months earlier, and it had left her completely paralyzed on one side of her body, unable to speak a word. It felt like an eternity since I last had a real conversation with her, and I didn't know if I ever would again. It was close to midnight by the time I finished getting her settled into bed. She wasn't sleeping well these days, and I had to be extra careful when helping her into bed so she wouldn't hurt herself. I tucked her in, made sure the room was warm enough, and kissed her goodnight, though I wasn't sure if she really understood. Her eyes would follow me, but her face always seemed lost in some place I couldn't reach. Over the past week or so, she'd been doing something new. It was almost like she was trying to communicate something, but it didn't make sense. Every night when I put her to bed, just a few minutes after the light went out, she'd start screaming. I'd rush into the room, my heart in my throat, to find her sobbing and pulling on her hair as if something invisible was tormenting her. I couldn't make out what she was so afraid of, and she couldn't tell me. But I tried. I'd ask her questions, all yes or no questions, and she'd nod or shake her head. She'd point toward the upper corner of the room, as if something up there was causing her distress. It seemed like there was something she was trying to explain about her parents, something about a photograph of them that she kept reaching for, though I couldn't understand why. She never had been very religious, but sometimes she would kiss the crucifix I had on her bedside table, and I couldn't help but feel uneasy. I tried my best to soothe her, but some nights I couldn't help but wonder if there was something more sinister going on. The idea that maybe there was something in that room, something she couldn't see but I might have been blind to, began to creep into my mind. That night, however, was different. For the first time in a while, she didn't scream. She was silent, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the silence. It felt too thick, too heavy. I turned my attention to the mess left in the living room from the dinner. Dishes, dirty plates, half-finished glasses of wine. The house, which was old and creaky, smelled like stale food and burnt-on cheese. I knew I had to clean it up before I could even think about going to bed. It felt like a mountain of work that would never get done, but there was no choice. I started picking up the towels that had been left scattered around the couch and the armchair. I was bone-tired, but I could hear my Nana's soft breathing from the bedroom. At least she was calm tonight. I straightened up, bending over to put the towels in their proper place when I heard it. Voices. Men's voices, low and indistinct, just clear enough for me to hear, and coming from somewhere in the house. I immediately assumed that, in my exhaustion, I'd somehow turned on the TV in the kitchen, the one that had been deadbolt behind a door on the far side of the kitchen. I wasn't sure why, but that thought put me on edge. I went to grab the remote, but when I pushed the power button, the voices didn't stop. The TV wasn't on. I walked toward the kitchen, every footstep feeling like it echoed too loudly in the quiet house. The voices seemed to fade as I neared the bathroom, and then, nothing. The sound of water running in the pipes filled the air. I paused, listening. There was a slight hum from the water, like it was running in the background, and it didn't seem out of place, but something about the voices made my skin crawl. I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was just that I was overtired. Maybe the exhaustion was messing with my mind. I told myself that was it. I turned back to the towels, but as I did, I caught sight of something strange. Papers. They were on the floor, papers that had been neatly stacked on the table just a few moments before. I blinked, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. Maybe I had knocked them off without realizing. I didn't know. I picked them up and put them back on the table, trying to ignore the prickling feeling on the back of my neck. Something was still off, but I pushed it down and moved into the kitchen, grabbing a few dishes that had been left behind. I was trying to focus on the task at hand, telling myself I just had to get through this last bit of cleaning, then I could rest. I passed the bathroom again, but this time, something made me stop. It wasn't the sound of running water, or the voices that I was already trying to convince myself didn't exist. No, it was something else. something far worse. There, just inside the bathroom doorway, stood a small man. He was wearing a hat. It wasn't the man's face that unnerved me, or the way he seemed to move in strange, jerky little steps. It was the fact that he was dancing. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen. I kept trying to convince myself it wasn't real, but the longer I looked, the more surreal it became. The man, dancing as if there was nothing wrong, didn't seem to notice me. He just continued, his feet shuffling in an almost rhythmic pattern, twirling on his toes. It didn't make sense, and I wasn't about to stick around to figure it out. I shut the bathroom door with a forceful slam, then went back to cleaning, telling myself it was just a trick of the mind. I was tired, overworked, probably just seeing things. I turned around to find the TV cable on the kitchen floor, right in the middle of the room, in plain view. It hadn't been there before. I felt my pulse quicken. I bent down to pick it up, my hands shaking slightly. It was an old cable, and I couldn't remember the last time I had seen it. Why was it out? The deadbolt room had always been locked. It was supposed to stay locked. But now the cable was there, lying in the middle of the floor like some kind of message I didn't understand. I dropped it on the table, turning back to the dishes, trying to distract myself. But as I washed the plates, I started humming to keep my mind occupied. I was in control, right? I told myself over and over again that nothing was wrong. No ghosts, no strange little man, no cables appearing out of nowhere. That's when I heard it. 3 loud, distinct knocks on the bottom of the kitchen sink. It sounded like something was crouched underneath it, knocking with its knuckles, like it was trying to get my attention. I froze. I couldn't just ignore it. I couldn't. I picked up the dish I was holding, feeling the cold ceramic in my fingers, and dropped it onto the sink with a little force, trying to see if maybe I had accidentally created an echo with my movements. I waited. Nothing. For a moment, all I could hear was the sound of the water running. Silence. Then, knock, knock, knock. The cabinet door beneath the sink swung open, as if by its own volition. The door hit my knee twice, hard, pausing between the strikes as if someone or something was deliberately pushing it. I dropped the dish. It shattered on the floor. No, I muttered under my breath, my heart racing. I stumbled backward, my hands trembling. No, no, no. I turned around and bolted toward the living room, not caring if the dishes were dirty or the house was a mess. I had to get away from whatever it was. I crossed the living room quickly, my eyes darting nervously, and as I passed my Nana's room, I said the Lord's Prayer under my breath, whispering the words to myself to calm the rising fear. I wasn't sure what was happening, but I needed something to make it stop. When I reached my Nana's room, I locked the door behind me and stayed with her. I stayed close, watching her quiet, steady breathing, too scared to go back into the kitchen. After that night, she never screamed again. The next morning, things were calm. Too calm. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something, whatever it was, had been watching me. My Nana never woke up scared, never reached for her crucifix in fear again. She just slept. I never figured out what it was that had been lurking in that house, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't staying alone in that house again. Not ever. I remember it like it was yesterday. The house was quiet, too quiet, except for the faint buzz of the TV in my parents' room. I was home alone for the weekend. It wasn't that unusual, but still, being in the house by myself always felt different. I wasn't exactly scared, but there was a certain heaviness in the air. It was like the house had a life of its own when no one else was around. It was an old place, creaky floors, and a musty scent in the hallways that never quite went away. My parents had gone to visit some friends, and I had no plans of going anywhere. I'd planned to spend the weekend watching movies, maybe a little bit of gaming, just to pass the time. That night, around 2 a.m., I was lying in bed in my parents' room, watching some late-night reruns on TV. I was alone, and I think that's part of what made the whole thing so unsettling. You know how sometimes when you're by yourself, you just get a feeling? It's not a noise or anything specific, but an eerie sensation that something's off. I felt that. I hadn't really been paying attention to the TV for a while. My eyes were tired, and the glow from the screen was warm and relaxing, but I kept feeling like something was wrong. It wasn't even the kind of feeling where you hear noises or see shadows moving. It was a more primal feeling, the kind you get when you know someone's looking at you. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. It was late, and maybe I was just tired. but the feeling didn't go away. I couldn't help myself. I slowly turned my head towards the doorway. The hallway was dark, but I could make out the vague outlines of the walls and the door frame. And that's when I saw it. A figure. A shadow. Not quite a person, but shaped like one. It stood in the hallway, motionless. It was a man-shaped mass, but it didn't have any real details, no face, no features, just a dark, black outline, almost as if it absorbed the darkness around it. I remember the way it stood there, unmoving, like it was waiting for me to notice. My heart skipped a beat, and I immediately sat up, my body frozen. I knew it wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me. This was real. The shape didn't move, it didn't blink, it just stared at me. The only light in the hallway came from the TV, faint but enough to cast the silhouette clearly against the dark. I could see the outline of a person, tall, thin, like a man, but the figure itself was pure black, absorbing everything around it. I don't know why, but I couldn't look away. It was like it was pulling me in, locking my eyes with it. I tried to convince myself that it was just my mind making things up. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or I was just seeing things because I was so tired. But something deep down, something instinctual, told me that this wasn't a trick. This was real. It was the longest 5 seconds of my life. We just stared at each other. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, my breath catching in my chest. I felt trapped, like I couldn't move, like the shadow had some sort of control over me. My mind raced. Was it someone who had broken into the house? A burglar? No, it couldn't be. I would have heard the door open, right? My brain scrambled for answers, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But nothing fit. It didn't make sense. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure turned. It wasn't slow or dramatic. It just pivoted, almost as if it was as natural as breathing, and walked down the hallway. It didn't seem hurried or frightened. It was as if it knew exactly what it was doing. I didn't move, not until it was completely out of my line of sight. It was only then that I realized I was holding my breath. I exhaled shakily, but my heart was still racing. I was frozen in place. I didn't want to go down the hallway. I didn't want to get up, but I knew I had to do something. But before I could even think, I heard it. A loud crash. The sound came from the kitchen area. It was sudden and sharp, like something heavy had fallen or been knocked over. It made my blood run cold. I didn't know if it was from the figure or something else entirely, but I knew I didn't want to check. I couldn't bring myself to move. I just sat there, staring at the hallway, my eyes wide, my mind racing. My body was shaking, but I couldn't tear myself away. I turned the TV up louder, just to drown out the panic in my head. I didn't want to hear anything. I didn't want to move. So, I turned the channel to something light, something I could pretend was normal, and the first thing that came to mind was the Disney Channel. I don't even know why. It was probably the most childish thing I could have done, but I was desperate for comfort. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, watching whatever was on TV. I don't even remember what it was. I couldn't focus. I just kept waiting for something else to happen, for the figure to come back, for something to go wrong. But nothing did. I just sat there in the dark room, watching cartoons, trying to pretend everything was fine. I don't even remember when I fell asleep. I think I eventually did, but I was still on edge, even in my sleep. The next morning, the sun was shining through the blinds, and it felt like nothing had happened. The house was quiet again, but this time it didn't feel as suffocating. I got out of bed and made my way down the hall, still groggy from the night before. My mind was clouded with sleep, but as I passed by the bathroom, I noticed something odd. The mirror that usually hung on the wall near the bathroom door was gone. It wasn't just hanging crooked or cracked, it was completely gone. And when I looked down, I saw the shards of glass scattered across the floor. The mirror had fallen, and it was shattered into a million pieces. There was no sign of what had caused it to fall, no indication of how it had happened. It was just there, broken. I stood in the hallway, staring at the shards, feeling a cold shiver run down my spine. I don't know what it was about that moment, but it all came crashing down. The figure, the crash, the feeling that I wasn't alone. It all made sense now. Something had been in the house with me. I didn't know what it was, and I didn't want to know. But I knew what I saw, and I knew what I felt. I couldn't explain it, but I knew. When my parents came back, they didn't believe me. They laughed it off, saying it was probably just the wind or some other logical explanation. They thought I was imagining things or exaggerating. But I knew what I saw, and I knew it wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. I don't know what that shadow figure was, or why the mirror fell, but I do know that something was in that house with me. Something that shouldn't have been there. And even though my family brushed it off, I'll never forget what happened. I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, the terror of staring into the darkness, and the chill that ran down my spine when I heard that crash. I don't stay in that room anymore, and I don't go down that hallway alone after dark. I'm not sure what I saw, but I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone that night. And whatever it was real. It was one of those mornings in December when the cold hangs in the air like a heavy blanket, suffocating you from the moment you step outside. The Georgia winter hadn't quite hit its full stride yet, but it was already dipping into the low 30s, with a damp chill that made everything feel colder than it really was. It was the kind of morning that made you want to stay curled up in bed, warm and comfortable. But instead, I found myself in the cab of a truck, parked on a tree farm 3 miles from home, waiting for a trailer to arrive so my brother and I could get to work. My boss had just bought a small truck for my brother and me to use for hauling supplies around the farm, and that morning we were supposed to load up some semi-trailers with pine seedlings. It was routine stuff for us by this point, but the cold and the early hour made everything feel a little heavier. The trailer was supposed to arrive at 6 a.m., but we were told it could be later, so the plan was simple. Arrive early, keep the truck running to stay warm, maybe even get some sleep until the trailer showed up. My boss said he'd still count the hours, so there was no rush. We arrived at the farm just as the sky was starting to brighten, the faintest hint of daylight breaking through the darkness. The lot was empty, and there was no sign of the trailer yet. My brother and I climbed into the truck, the heater already blowing warm air into the cab. It was a relief to feel the heat in such a cold morning, but before long, I started to feel the weight of sleep pulling me under. My brother, always the more sensible one, was already leaning back in his seat, eyes closed, and it didn't take long before I followed suit. The truck hummed gently in the background, the warmth of the heater and the sound of the engine lullaby-like as my body sank deeper into sleep. I don't know how long I had been out, but at some point, I was woken by something, faint at first, like a whisper in the distance. My name. It wasn't loud. It wasn't urgent. It was soft, almost like the way someone might call to you when they don't want to disturb you, but they still need your attention. It sounded like my mom, the way she would call me in the mornings, soft and caring. "Mark," it said. I stirred but couldn't move, couldn't open my eyes. I tried to respond, but my body felt heavy, like it was made of lead. I could hear the faint calling of my name again, but this time, it was a little louder, a little clearer. "Mark." I felt paralyzed. It wasn't a dream. I was fully aware of where I was, of the truck, of the cold air outside the window, but for some reason, I couldn't move. It was like my eyelids had become impossibly heavy, too thick to open. I could feel my heart start to race, and my breathing quickened as I tried to respond, to ask what was going on, but nothing came out. I couldn't speak. All I could do was lie there, hearing my name being called over and over, but feeling so incredibly distant from everything. Then, all at once, I pushed myself awake. It was like a switch had flipped. I mustered every ounce of strength I could find and forced my eyes open. The voice stopped immediately, but my body was still sluggish, like it was fighting me every step of the way. It took another few seconds before I realized I was still in the truck, still sitting there, though now fully awake. My hand felt stiff as I reached out and grabbed the door handle, forcing myself to move. I don't know how long I sat there before I finally managed to open the door, but once it was open, I stumbled out of the truck. The cold hit me like a slap, but it wasn't enough to snap me back to full alertness. I felt weak, my limbs not quite responding how I wanted them to. I dropped to the ground on all fours, leaning against the truck, and took a few moments to breathe deeply, trying to clear my head. My vision swam a little, the edges blurry as I focused on staying grounded. It took a minute or two for my brain to catch up, for the fog to lift, and for my body to feel like it was actually mine again. The truck was still running, and the air was still cold and fresh, but everything felt so off. Finally, I felt a bit more steady. I turned off the truck and walked around to my brother's side, tapping on his window. He woke up slowly, rubbing his eyes and squinting at the dim light filtering through the sky. It took him longer than usual to fully come around, and I remember wondering why it was taking him so long to wake up. It was like his body didn't want to leave sleep either. "Get some air," I told him, still trying to shake off the weird sensation in my limbs. I didn't feel like myself yet. But when he opened his door and stepped outside, I felt the weight of the silence in the truck with me, like something had just shifted. I looked around, trying to shake the sense of unease that had settled in my stomach, but there was no one else around. It was just us, the two of us out there in the middle of nowhere, on that cold December morning. I took a deep breath and started to explain what had happened. I told him about the voice calling my name, about how I'd struggled to wake up. As I spoke, though, he looked at me, confusion spreading across his face. "I tried to crack the window earlier," he said slowly, his voice edged with uncertainty. "But you told me to close that damn window." I thought I was hearing things. I froze. I didn't remember saying that. Not at all. The words felt foreign in my mind. Why would I have said that? It wasn't like me to snap at him, especially over something so small. I apologized right away, but the unease lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I didn't know what. Maybe it was the weird way I had woken up, or the strange sensation in my limbs. Maybe it was the fact that neither of us had heard the trailer pull up. I couldn't tell. We didn't talk about it much more, just got to work when the trailer arrived, unloading the pine seedlings. As the sun rose higher, the temperature warmed up, and by the time we were done loading, it had reached the low 60s. The cold had given way to a mild winter day, and we decided to drive back home slowly, windows down to kill time. That day, everything seemed normal again. There was no trace of the weird heaviness I'd felt earlier, and no more strange occurrences. We drove back home, and I thought I'd shaken it off. It was just one of those odd moments that didn't make sense, but I wasn't one to dwell on things like that. Still, something about the whole situation stayed with me, just under the surface, like a question I couldn't answer. A week later, I saw my boss again and asked him where the truck had gone after he'd taken it. He told me it was in the shop, getting a new exhaust. I didn't think much of it at the time, but then, as he continued talking, he mentioned that there had been an exhaust leak. He said it had been leaking carbon monoxide into the truck cabin. My stomach sank as the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. That morning, I hadn't just woken up from a strange dream. I had almost passed out from the carbon monoxide poisoning. That faint calling of my name, the way I couldn't move, the heaviness in my body, it all started to make sense. The truck's exhaust system had been leaking, and the fumes had been seeping into the cabin while we slept, poisoning us slowly. I had been so close to not waking up at all. I'm not a superstitious person, but the more I thought about it, the more it felt like something, or someone, had made sure I woke up. The voice calling my name, the way I struggled to move, how my brother hadn't noticed the danger either. It was all too coincidental. I don't know if it was luck, instinct, or something else, but waking up when I did was the difference between life and death that morning. That's the part that sticks with me now. We were lucky. I don't know if it was just a strange coincidence or if someone, was looking out for us. All I know is that if I hadn't woken up when I did, things could have turned out very differently. The thought still sends chills down my spine. It was a typical weekend that I had been looking forward to for weeks. My best friend, Kayla, and her boyfriend, James, had decided to head out for a camping trip in the Sumter National Forest. It was a last-minute thing. We were all looking for an escape from the noise of the city and the stress of daily life. Just a quiet night out in the woods, with nothing but rain and the occasional animal rustling in the distance. It sounded perfect. The drive up had been calm enough, though a bit slow due to the heavy rain that had been falling steadily since we got on the highway. As we passed through the smaller, quieter towns on the way to the forest, the rain began to hit harder. The kind of rain that makes you squint your eyes even when the windshield wipers are at full speed. The forest itself, once we finally reached it, felt isolated. There weren't any other cars around, and the gravel roads leading in were narrow, with tall trees on either side. I remember thinking that it felt like we had driven into a place that nobody had been to in a long time. The only sound was the soft hum of the tires on wet gravel and the steady beat of the rain. Even though we'd arrived late, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was holding its breath, like it was waiting for something. We parked the SUV near a clearing that looked like it had been used for camping before, but there wasn't a soul around. It was just us and the rain, and the trees stretching out into the darkness beyond the headlights. After we unpacked, Kayla set up the small camp stove while James and I worked on getting the back of the SUV ready for the night. We decided to sleep inside the car. It was too wet and cold for a tent, and we all felt safer that way. It wasn't exactly the camping experience we'd hoped for, but it was comfortable enough. The sound of the rain on the roof of the SUV became soothing after a while. We sat there in the dim glow of the interior lights, chatting about random things and laughing, trying to ignore the fact that the weather outside was becoming worse. Eventually, I pulled out my old copy of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, the kind of thing that Kayla and I used to read when we were kids. The stories were corny, sure, but they always seemed to creep under your skin. I read a couple aloud to pass the time. The words seemed to take on a darker tone, made worse by the weather outside. James had fallen asleep by the time I finished the last story, but Kayla and I weren't quite ready to sleep. The rain was still pouring down, and the rhythmic sound on the roof kept us wide awake. We talked about random things, mostly nonsense, just trying to stay entertained. It was around midnight when the atmosphere outside started to change. The rain had settled into a steady rhythm, but it was no longer just rain. As I lay there, staring at the dark sky through the windshield, I noticed that the sound of the rain was beginning to change. It sounded like footsteps, faint, distant, but there. The rain hitting the ground, the leaves, the wet earth. It wasn't just the sound of water anymore. It sounded like someone was walking out there, somewhere in the dark. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The sound of footsteps, mixed with the wind and the rain, had probably just made me paranoid. But then, I heard it again. This time, it was closer. Like someone was stepping through the woods, right near the edge of the clearing. Kayla must have heard it too, because she sat up, looking out the window with wide eyes. We both listened, not saying a word, but I could tell she was just as uneasy as I was. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely breaking the silence. Kayla nodded, her hand gripping the side of the seat. "Yeah, I did. What is that?" We both turned our heads toward the trees on the right side of the car. The headlights were still on, casting a weak, yellowish light on the dense forest. The shadows seemed to stretch forever into the trees, and I couldn't see anything clearly. But the sounds continued, footsteps, dragging through the wet ground, closer now, like they were moving in our direction. I looked over at James, who was snoring softly in the back seat. I shook him awake, my heart pounding in my chest. "James," I whispered, urgency creeping into my voice. "James, wake up." He groggily opened his eyes, his expression confused, but when he saw the tension in both of our faces, he became alert. "What's wrong?" "I hear something outside." "It sounds like footsteps," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you hear it?" James looked out the window, squinting into the darkness, his brow furrowing. The sound of the rain was louder now, but the footsteps, if that's what they were, seemed to be right on the edge of our vision. "Maybe it's an animal?" he suggested, though his voice sounded uncertain. "I'll go check." "Are you serious?" Kayla's voice was tight, almost panicked. "James, don't." But James was already opening the door. Before we could stop him, he was out of the car, shining a flashlight into the trees. The beam cut through the rain-soaked darkness, but it only seemed to make the woods feel even more oppressive, like the trees were closing in. "James!" I shouted, but he didn't respond. He just moved further into the woods, the beam of the flashlight dancing through the trees. Kayla and I exchanged a nervous glance. The air around us felt heavy, thick with tension. We waited in silence, listening to the sounds of James moving through the wet underbrush. It felt like an eternity, but it was only a couple of minutes before he came sprinting back, his flashlight swinging wildly in his hands. He was breathing hard, his face pale. "Go! Go! Go!" he screamed, his voice high with panic. My heart jumped into my throat. Without thinking, I slammed the car into reverse, and we backed out of the clearing as fast as I could. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the figure of James running toward us, but what I saw instead froze me in place. A figure emerged from the trees, tall, moving fast, and it looked like it was running directly at James. At first, I thought it was a man, but something was off. His movements were jerky, almost unnatural. The flashlight from James's hand flickered for a second before he dropped it, and when the beam hit the figure, I could see it more clearly. The man, or whatever he was covered in what looked like filthy, torn rags. His face was smeared with dirt and blood, and I could barely make out any features, except that his eyes were wide, staring, almost feral. His mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, and when the light hit him, he stopped dead in his tracks. For a moment, I could hear nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. The figure didn't flinch when the headlights hit him. He just stared. Then, without warning, he started running toward James. "Go!" I screamed again, my foot slamming on the gas pedal. The SUV lurched forward, tires spinning on the wet gravel as I sped away. Kayla was shaking beside me, her hands gripping the seat. I didn't dare look back, but I could still hear the sound of the man's footsteps, pounding in the rain, getting louder as we sped away. I could feel my chest tightening with every second that passed. We didn't stop until we were safely parked in the dimly lit parking lot of a Piggly Wiggly. The first place we could think of that was open. The familiar glow of the store's lights seemed like a small comfort in the middle of nowhere. James was still breathing heavily when he climbed into the car. His face was pale, his hands shaking. He didn't speak for a long time, but when he did, his voice was barely a whisper. "That wasn't a man," he said, his eyes wide with fear. Whatever it wasn't human. We stayed in the parking lot for the rest of the night, too shaken to move, too scared to go back into the woods. We didn't talk much after that, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The rain kept coming down, harder than ever, but it couldn't drown out the fear that was still in the air. In the morning, we drove home quietly, none of us willing to speak about what had happened. The woods of Sumter National Forest felt like a distant memory, and I could still hear the footsteps in my mind whenever I closed my eyes. What James saw, what we all heard, still haunts me, and I wonder sometimes what could have happened if we hadn't left when we did. When I was about 8 years old, there was a day during school that I still think about sometimes, even now. It happened during recess, on one of those overcast, chilly days when the sun doesn't really come out and the wind keeps blowing just enough to make the air feel sharp. I remember the way the grass felt under my sneakers, cold and damp, making that squishy sound when you stepped on it. The sky was a dull gray, and the whole schoolyard looked kind of washed out, like a photo with no color. Recess was always a mix of noise and energy. Kids running around the swings, climbing the monkey bars, yelling during tag games, or just wandering in packs, talking about who knows what. That day I was mostly by myself. I was never the loudest kid. I had friends, but I didn't mind spending recess alone either, kicking at rocks or watching birds peck at the ground. I liked to explore, to look for weird things, bugs, strange cracks in the pavement, random junk under the hedges. I wasn't trying to get into trouble, just always curious about things that other kids didn't notice. I had just walked past the tire swings when I saw a group of kids standing near the old storage room door. That room was built into the side of the school building, with a heavy metal door that stayed locked. None of us really knew what was inside. Some kids said it held old desks and broken chairs. Others thought it had gym equipment or forgotten art supplies. We weren't allowed near it, but no one really enforced that rule. Teachers stayed closer to the playground and the basketball courts, not the far corner by the storage room. The crowd of kids caught my attention right away. They were all bunched up, nervous, yelling at each other. I remember how pale some of them looked. One boy had his hand over his mouth, like he was going to be sick. A couple others kept stepping back from the door, like it might burst open at any second. I wasn't close enough to hear what they were saying at first, but I could tell they were scared. Not fake playground scared either. Real fear, the kind you feel in your chest before your brain even understands why. So I walked over. The closer I got, the more I could make out their voices. They were warning each other, telling everyone not to look, saying something like, "There's an eyeball. It's looking at us." At first I didn't understand. An eyeball? That made no sense. What kind of eyeball? An actual eye? I figured maybe it was a prank, or a rubber Halloween decoration someone had stuck in the door. But even thinking that, I could feel this weird nervous flutter in my stomach. I stopped a few feet away, watching how the other kids acted. Some were genuinely panicked, tugging at each other's sleeves, pointing at the keyhole on the door. One girl kept shaking her head, like she didn't want to believe what she saw. Another boy, a grade above me, was pale like he'd seen something that made him forget where he was. That's when I got really curious. I had to see what they were talking about. I didn't believe it was anything real. Maybe a drawing or a joke. Maybe they were all just messing around and pretending. I pushed through the small crowd, careful not to bump anyone, and walked right up to the door. It was an old metal door, thick and heavy looking. with faded paint that had chipped away in places to show rust underneath. The keyhole was just below the handle, a round metal piece with a tiny slit in the center. The edges were worn smooth from years of use, probably by teachers and janitors opening and closing it 1,000 times. I leaned forward slowly. My heartbeat sped up, but not in a bad way. More like when you're about to open a mystery box or peek into a room you're not supposed to see. I bent down and squinted through the keyhole. And that's when I saw it. There was an eye, a full, wide-open eye staring straight back at me. Not blinking, not moving, just there, right on the other side, looking directly into mine. It filled the tiny space perfectly, like it had been waiting for someone to look through. Everything in my body froze. I stopped breathing for a second. My stomach dropped so fast it felt like the ground was falling out from under me. The eye looked real, not like a drawing or a doll's eye. It had detail, tiny red veins, a dark pupil, a gray-blue iris, and this weird shine, like the surface was wet. I shot backwards so fast I almost tripped. The cold air hit my face harder. My ears were ringing. My throat was tight. I could barely think. And then I felt it, this warm rush down my legs, soaking my pants. I had peed myself. I didn't even realize it right away. Not until I saw the darker color spreading down the front of my jeans and felt the heat turning cold in the breeze. It was like my body had just shut down for a second and done its own thing without asking. I remember the looks from the other kids. Some were still focused on the door, but a few turned to me with wide eyes when they saw what happened. My face burned hotter than I thought was possible. I didn't know what to do, so I just stood there, frozen, shaking, staring at the door like it might swing open. Eventually a teacher came over, probably alerted by the noise, or by someone running to tell them something was wrong. The moment an adult showed up, the group scattered like ants. I heard my name called, but I couldn't answer. I was still locked in that weird frozen state, somewhere between fear and humiliation. I don't even remember what I said. I think someone explained that I saw the eyeball too, and that I had an accident. The teacher led me away, one hand on my shoulder, saying something about going to the nurse's office. I walked stiffly, pants cold and heavy, keeping my eyes on the ground. I remember how quiet everything felt then. No more yelling, just wind and distant laughter from the playground. At the nurse's office, they gave me a pair of oversized gym shorts and a plastic bag for my pants. I sat on a cot while the nurse tried to calm me down, asking if I felt sick or scared or hurt. I nodded even though I didn't know what I was feeling. Just messed up, confused. My brain kept circling back to that eye. It didn't feel like a prank or a trick. It felt too real. I stayed there for a while, long enough for the rest of recess to end and for things to settle down. Eventually the principal showed up, followed by a janitor. They were talking quietly just outside the door. I couldn't hear most of it, but I picked up a few words: mirror, inspection, locked, and scared kids. The janitor had to open up the storage room to check what was going on. A few teachers were outside too, probably making sure no more kids wandered near it. I sat on the cot, legs swinging slightly, trying to pretend I didn't care what they found. After a while, someone, maybe the nurse, maybe a teacher, told me what they'd discovered. The janitor had gone in, and everything was normal. Nothing strange. No intruder. No animals. No prank toys. But leaning against the far wall, directly in line with the keyhole, was a tall, rectangular mirror. One of those old dressing room kinds with a wooden frame and a slightly warped surface. That's all it was. A mirror. The eyeball we all saw, the one I saw, was just our own reflection. Our own eyes, staring back at us through the keyhole. The angle and the lighting made it perfect. It was dark in there, and with our faces so close to the hole, we only saw our own eyes staring back. But we didn't recognize it. The mind plays tricks when you're already expecting something scary. And when one kid panics, the fear spreads like wildfire. Hearing that made me feel a little better, but not completely. The embarrassment stayed. The feeling of fear stayed too, like a bruise. Even though it wasn't real, the moment had felt real. The fear had been real. That awful eye, my own eye, had felt like something alive and separate. I still remember the tiny veins, the unmoving stare, the way it seemed to be watching and waiting. Knowing it was just a mirror didn't erase what it felt like. I stayed inside for the rest of the day. My mom was called, but they didn't make a big deal about it. The teachers tried to be kind, and no one punished me or the other kids. It was just chalked up to a weird misunderstanding. A spooky accident. Still, word got around. Kids talk. Some laughed. Others claimed they had seen it too, even if they hadn't. For the next few weeks, nobody went near that door again. The mirror was removed, and the janitor locked the room tighter than before. Eventually, people moved on, found new things to whisper about during recess. The story faded, but for me, it didn't really fade. I kept thinking about how something so simple could scare me that much. I thought about how powerful our own minds can be, especially when we're young. About how fear can sneak up and twist what we see, turning our own reflection into a monster. Even now, years later, I can still see that in my mind. Not because it was something evil, not because it was watching me, but because it was me. It was the look in my own eye when I thought I was in danger. The wide stare, the silent scream, the helpless panic. That day taught me something I didn't have words for at the time. Sometimes the scariest things we see are just mirrors. Not because they show monsters, but because they show us exactly how we are when we're afraid. A few months after I had moved into my new house, I was starting to feel a little more comfortable in the space. It wasn't perfect yet. I still had boxes scattered around in rooms that I hadn't gotten around to unpacking, but the place was mine. I spent most of my time cleaning, organizing, and slowly turning it into a home. It was a long weekend, and I had the whole day to myself. I didn't have any big plans, just a list of mundane chores I wanted to get done, along with a little cooking to treat myself. The kitchen had quickly become my favorite spot in the house. It was bright, and the windows let in so much light. It felt welcoming, even if the place still felt a little empty. I had a few simple meals in mind, nothing extravagant, but a nice roast for the main course and some sides to go with it. I put the food in the oven and set the timer, then decided to take a quick shower while it cooked. I had the house to myself, the silence only interrupted by the soft hum of the oven and the occasional bird call outside. I wasn't in a rush, so I took my time, enjoying the solitude. The shower was refreshing. I was just drying off when I heard it, the faint but distinct beep, 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 beep of the oven timer, signaling that the food was ready. I didn't think much of it at first. It was just the usual sound I had been hearing for the past few months, reminding me that the meal was done. Wrapping myself in a towel, I walked out of the bathroom and into the kitchen. The warmth of the oven felt good on my skin, and I pulled the roast out, setting it on the counter. I moved quickly, wanting to get everything ready before the food started to cool. I started to prepare the sides, chopping vegetables and stirring pots on the stove. My mind was focused on the task at hand, nothing out of the ordinary. After a few minutes, I went back into the bathroom to finish drying my hair and get dressed. I was feeling pretty good. The house was starting to come together. The meal was almost ready, and I had the whole day ahead of me to relax and enjoy the fruits of my labor. But when I walked back into the kitchen, I froze. There, on the white tiled floor, was a small splatter of blood. Just a drop, maybe two, but it was unmistakable. Dark, crimson red. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. My first instinct was to panic. I stared at the spot for a few seconds, trying to make sense of it, but it didn't add up. The blood wasn't from me. I had checked myself thoroughly after the shower. I wasn't injured. So where the hell had it come from? I whipped around the kitchen, scanning the area, my mind starting to race. My first thought was that someone had broken into the house. Maybe they had cut themselves on the broken glass from a window I hadn't noticed. Maybe they were still here, hiding somewhere in my house, waiting to do God knows what. I couldn't stay in the kitchen. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking, and called my then boyfriend. I could barely speak, trying to keep my voice from cracking, telling him that something was wrong, that I thought someone might be inside. He was at work, though, and couldn't come. I was on my own, stuck in this huge house that now felt like a prison. My mind was filled with terrifying thoughts, someone in the walls, someone waiting in the shadows. Every creak of the house made my skin crawl. I needed help, but no one was close enough. My neighbor was the next person I called. I explained the situation, trying to stay calm, but I could feel my breath catching in my throat. I needed someone to help me check the house, someone who could be here quickly. She was kind enough to agree, and within minutes, she was knocking on my door, ready to come inside and figure out what was going on. We stood in the entryway, each of us holding a knife we'd grabbed from the kitchen, trying to steel ourselves for whatever we might find. I looked over at my neighbor, trying to keep my face composed, but I could tell she was just as freaked out as I was. The blood on the floor was undeniable. It was real. We both knew that. But the question was, how had it gotten there? The house felt different now, even though it was still the same familiar place. Every room seemed ominous. We started with the bedrooms, pushing open each door slowly, peering inside, and listening for any sound of movement. The house was quiet, eerily so. No one was there. We checked every closet, every corner. No one. Still, the blood on the floor didn't make sense. My mind kept running through every possible explanation, none of them reassuring. Someone had to be hiding in here. I was starting to imagine worse and worse things, each scenario more terrifying than the last. My mind had gone from an intruder hiding somewhere to someone waiting for me in the basement. The thought of the basement sent a chill down my spine. The basement door was in the kitchen, just beyond where the blood had been. It was heavy, wooden, and always a little bit creaky. It was one of those things that you knew you didn't want to open if you didn't have to. The stairs were narrow and steep, leading down into the darkness. It was the last place I wanted to go, but we had to. With a shaky breath, I led the way down. The basement was large, too large, with boxes stacked everywhere. The air was musty, the smell of old wood and dust in the air. My heart raced with every step. We were both silent, the only sound our footsteps echoing in the hollow space. We checked every corner, every box, every dark crevice. There was nothing but old junk, spider webs, and piles of forgotten things. Nothing out of the ordinary. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we went back upstairs. My neighbor gave me a sympathetic look, though I could see she was relieved as well. We went back into the kitchen, and I cleaned up the blood. It wasn't much, just a few drops, but it felt like a symbol of something. Something I couldn't quite place. I thanked my neighbor, who promised to check in later, and she left. As I stood there in the kitchen, alone again, I tried to settle my racing thoughts. I had been on edge for hours, adrenaline coursing through my veins. But everything seemed fine. There was no intruder. No one had broken in. The house was just as it had always been. Nothing was out of place. Yet the blood was still there. Still unexplained. I decided to go on with my day. I had a meal to finish preparing, after all. But my mind kept drifting back to the strange sight in the kitchen. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Something about the blood seemed off. I wasn't sure what I had expected to find after checking the house, but I didn't expect to find nothing. A few hours later, after I'd eaten and cleaned up, I went to the bathroom. I had been so preoccupied with everything else that I hadn't even noticed earlier, but now I did. I had started my period. The realization hit me like a punch in the gut, the shame flooding in. The blood on the floor, the mystery, the panic, it all came rushing back, and I felt embarrassed. Of course it was mine. When I squatted down to take the food out of the oven earlier, I must have dripped just a drop or two. I hadn't realized it, but it had been there, right in front of me. The mystery was solved in the most mundane way possible. My heart settled, and my mind slowed down. I felt like an idiot for freaking out so much, but I was also relieved. There was no intruder, no danger lurking in the shadows. It had just been an accident. A stupid, simple accident. I cleaned up the blood from the floor and scrubbed it away, and the house felt normal again. I still felt a little silly for how I had reacted, but I couldn't help it. The unknown is scary, and when something is unexplained, your mind fills in the gaps with the worst possible scenarios. The rest of the day went on as planned. I finished up my chores, sat down to relax, and tried to forget about the panic. But part of me knew I would never forget that moment. How it felt to stand there, unsure of what was real and what was just my fear running wild. I had learned something about myself that day. When things don't make sense, my imagination can take over in ways I don't always expect. The blood wasn't the beginning of something bad. It was just a reminder that sometimes things aren't as scary as they seem. It all started during my sophomore year of high school. It was around the time when everyone had a house phone and a cell phone. The novelty of texting was still new, but the constant buzzing of messages and the never-ending calls became a part of the landscape of high school life. I didn't think much of it at first when I started receiving weird, anonymous calls and text messages. It was just one of those things, right? Some people like to mess with others. Prank calls were a dime a dozen back then, and even though it was a little unsettling, I figured it was harmless. The messages were vague, sometimes just short, cryptic sentences that didn't make sense. Other times, it was just weirdly inappropriate comments that left me confused, but nothing alarming enough to raise major concern. The calls would come at random hours, sometimes early in the morning, sometimes late at night. I could tell it wasn't anyone I knew because the voice sounded different every time. Sometimes it was muffled, other times it was clear but strained, like the person was hiding something. The messages were even stranger. People asking questions about things I never mentioned to anyone, like how I was feeling that day or where I was going. But I let it slide. It wasn't all that different from the usual pranks people pulled back in the day. The calls would stop for a while, and I would forget about them, go back to my routine, and then a few weeks later, they'd start up again. It was just a weird thing that I chalked up to some bored person trying to mess with me. As I got older, the calls became more persistent. By junior year, it wasn't just random calls. They started coming to my house phone too. At the time, not everyone had a cell phone, and I still had my old landline. I never gave my house number out, but somehow, the calls started reaching both my cell and home phone. It was unsettling. They would call at odd times, when I was alone in my room, or sometimes when I was with friends. At first, I thought it was just someone from school trying to mess with me, but the calls were different. These weren't just random. Hey, this is so-and-so. Want to go to the movies? They were far creepier. One night, I was sitting on the couch with my then-boyfriend when my phone rang. I had gotten so used to ignoring the calls that I didn't think twice about picking up. But this time, it wasn't a prank. I answered the phone and heard nothing for a moment, then a deep breath, followed by the sound of heavy breathing. That was when the voice came through, slightly muffled, but still clear enough to make me freeze. It was a man's voice, sounding way too familiar, but I couldn't place it. "Where are you right now?" he asked. The tone was unsettling, like he was sitting right next to me, whispering it in my ear. I hung up, heart pounding in my chest, and stared at the phone screen in confusion. But it didn't stop there. The next day, the same voice left a message on my voicemail saying, "I know where you are. I know what you're doing." The same thing happened several more times. At first, I thought it might be someone from school trying to mess with me. But then the calls started happening when I wasn't even home. How did they know where I was? I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Then, it started happening with my boyfriend. They began calling him, too. At first, it was just simple, weird questions like, "Do you know where she is right now? Is she with you?" They'd ask him if I was hanging out with certain people, or if he had seen me that day. But the calls started becoming more hostile. They would leave him voicemail messages accusing me of things I hadn't done. Horrible things. They'd say things like, "She's lying to you. She's not who you think she is. She's been out with other guys." I thought it was just a prank. But after a while, the frequency increased. There were nights when he would get 3 or 4 calls in a row, all from different numbers. The person on the other end of the line seemed to know too much. They would mention things I hadn't told him. It was getting to the point where I couldn't ignore it anymore. It wasn't just annoying, it was becoming terrifying. I started to wonder who could possibly know that much about me. But the calls always stopped, as if the person was just waiting for me to start feeling paranoid. Every time it would stop, I'd push it out of my mind and think, "It's over. It's done." By the time I reached college, I thought it was all behind me. I had stopped talking to most people from high school. I deleted my MySpace account, cleaned up my Facebook, and tried to have a fresh start. I thought that was the end of it. I was still dating the same guy, though, but other than him, I had cut ties with most of my past. I moved into the dorms, got a fresh start with new roommates, and for a while, everything seemed normal. But halfway through my freshman year, it started again. This time, the calls and texts were more personal, more sinister. They knew about the smallest details of my life. The messages started mentioning things I had never shared with anyone. I had told no one I was seeing a therapist for anxiety, but suddenly, the texts mentioned it. I hadn't even told anyone I had moved to a new apartment, but there it was. "I know where you live now. It's only a matter of time before I'm there." At first, I tried to dismiss it, thinking it was just some coincidence or a prank. But then, I started getting texts threatening to send pictures of me out to my friends and family. Pictures that didn't exist. They even mentioned Photoshop, talking about how they would make fake nude photos of me to send to people I knew. My stomach dropped. It wasn't funny anymore. I decided I'd had enough. I changed my number, but the calls didn't stop. The texts came from new numbers, sometimes even from unknown numbers that couldn't be traced. It was like no matter what I did, they kept finding a way to contact me. I tried blocking them, but it didn't help. It was like the person on the other side was getting more creative, more persistent. It took over my life, making me more paranoid every day. I stopped trusting anyone, even my roommates. I withdrew into myself. My boyfriend was the only person I trusted anymore, but even he started noticing how much I had changed. I wasn't the same person I was when I first met him. I was terrified, isolated, and sinking deeper into a depression I couldn't seem to escape. Then came that night. I was home visiting my parents when it happened. My boyfriend and I had gotten into a huge argument, and I had gone back to my parents' house to cool off. I had planned to stay for the weekend, but by the time I got home around midnight, things had already taken a turn. I was tired and upset. As I was sitting with my parents, talking about the fight, the phone rang. It was the landline. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar. "Is your daughter available for sexual services?" a man asked. My heart sank. I froze. I couldn't even move. My parents were sitting right there. I had no idea how to explain what was going on. Another call came in right after. It was the same thing. Over and over again, one call after another. Each time a different voice asking for the same thing. We tried blocking the calls, but there was no use. It was like the person on the other end was just waiting for us to try to stop them. It felt like they were everywhere. Finally, my parents had had enough. They called the police. We filed a report, changed our landline number, and hoped it would end there. But the next morning, we discovered the truth. Someone had posted my phone number on Craigslist, listing me as a prostitute. That was the moment I realized that my ex-boyfriend was behind it all. He had always been manipulative, controlling, and jealous, but I never realized how far he would go to make me feel powerless. I had always been in love with him, but now I felt disgusted. The police tried contacting him, but he was elusive. He disappeared, as if he had never been a part of my life. I felt trapped, suffocated by my own paranoia. It took months to get over it. I was afraid to trust anyone again. But eventually, I met someone else. A guy who didn't make me feel scared or trapped. Someone who cared about me and treated me with respect. I thought I was finally free of the past, but then one year, it started again. I had a new phone, a new number, and a completely different friend group. I had blocked everyone associated with my ex. But the texts came back. Each one came at the worst possible moment, often when I was with my husband. The messages were always the same, insinuating that I had cheated on him. They were the kind of texts meant to create a rift, to make us fight. They mentioned places I'd been, people I had talked to, things I hadn't told anyone. It was clear that whoever was behind it was still watching me. I couldn't take it anymore. I made another police report, and this time, I told them about my ex. We had to change my number again and block everyone who had my new contact info. This time, the detective was able to track down my ex, but he was gone, unreachable. I don't know if he stopped because he realized I was serious or if he simply gave up. Either way, I haven't heard from him since. Looking back now, I'm relieved. But the scar remains. I can't help but wonder how far he went with all of this, how much he had planned it. Was he watching me before we met? Was he tracking me all along? All those anonymous calls and texts, all the things he knew about me. It all makes sense now. He wasn't just some high school boyfriend. He was a stalker, a manipulator, someone who wanted to control me even after we broke up. But at least now I'm free. I have my life back, and I won't let it happen again. That experience was a nightmare I'll never fully shake off, but I'm stronger now. I'm with someone who respects me, someone who helps me stay grounded. I don't know if I'll ever fully recover from the fear, but I do know that I'm no longer the person I was back then. I'm not alone anymore, and that, for now, is enough. During the 1970s, before I was born, my dad worked as a trail guide in California. He was a man who loved the outdoors, and he spent his days leading groups of tourists on horseback across mountain trails, showing them the beauty of the California wilderness. He met a lot of people during his time working there, but one person he became especially close to was a Native American man. He wasn't sure exactly where the guy came from. He only knew that he came from a reservation, though he never said which one. The guy never explained why he left, either, but my dad didn't ask. He figured it was a personal matter, so he left it alone. This man started as a customer of my dad's, but he eventually became an employee, helping guide the tourists on horseback, just like my dad and his brother. He was a cool guy, quiet but always respectful and easy to get along with. My dad never questioned his past. He just knew that he was a man of the land, someone who understood the wilderness in a way few others did. One day, my dad and his brother, along with their Native American friend, were out on the trail with a group of tourists. The day was shaping up to be pretty ordinary. My dad and his brother were telling jokes, the kind that only siblings can share, while the tourists snapped photos of the breathtaking views. Everything was going smoothly as they made their way through the grassy chaparral, with the sun shining down on the fields. Then someone shouted, "Coyote," and pointed into a little valley on the left side of the trail. My dad and the others stopped their horses so that the group could get a good look at the animal. Coyotes are a common sight out there, so there was nothing unusual about it at first. My dad's friend, however, went quiet. My uncle kept his gaze fixed on the coyote, narrowing his eyes. My dad noticed and asked what was going on. "This coyote," my uncle said, his voice low and serious. "It doesn't look healthy." The coyote had long, thin legs, much longer than normal, and it didn't walk in the usual way. Most dogs move by lifting one front leg and the opposite back leg, but this coyote moved by lifting both legs on one side of its body at the same time, like a camel. It didn't seem right. It was off in a way that made the hairs on the back of my dad's neck stand up. Then my uncle pointed out something that was even stranger. The coyote's snout was about 3 inches longer than normal, and it held its nose up in the air as if it was sniffing for something, like it was hunting or searching for a scent. But that wasn't the most unsettling part. My dad noticed that the creature's tail wasn't right. It wasn't there at all. "Look at the tail," my dad's friend said, his voice shaking. My dad glanced at the coyote and was taken aback. "It doesn't have a tail," he said, confused. At that moment, my dad's friend went quiet, his face growing pale. He stared at the coyote for a long time, his finger trembling as he pointed at it. There was something about the way the creature moved and looked that made my dad's friend nervous, but he wouldn't say why. He only said, "I'll explain when we get back to camp." The group moved on, with the tourists excitedly chattering about the coyote they'd just spotted. But the animal didn't leave them alone. Instead of retreating back into the valley, it followed them, staying just at the edge of the field. My dad's friend remained silent, his eyes locked on the creature the entire time, but he didn't say a word. My uncle, trying to lighten the mood, joked around with the tourists, but my dad couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As they neared the camp, the coyote suddenly leapt out of the underbrush, startling everyone. It landed about 20 feet in front of them, right in the path of the horses. The horses reared back, kicking up dust, and the tourists screamed. The coyote didn't flinch. It didn't seem scared at all. It just stared directly at my dad's friend, its eyes unblinking. Then, something happened that made my dad's blood run cold. The coyote smiled. But this wasn't a normal dog smile, where they pant and wag their tails. No, this was something worse. The coyote bared its teeth in a wide, terrifying grin, showing off its yellow, brown-stained teeth. My dad's friend didn't react at first, but then slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of wood. It had an arrow burned into it. He held it up to the coyote, showing it the symbol, and without a word, the coyote stopped grinning. It turned its head, as though acknowledging the gesture, then let out a howl. But this wasn't like any coyote howl my dad had ever heard. It was low-pitched, almost like a human voice trying to speak through a throat filled with water. It was deep, guttural, and chilling, like the creature was drowning in its own breath. The howl lasted for a few long seconds. Then the coyote disappeared into the underbrush, running off into the trees with an unsettling speed. My uncle, trying to make light of the situation, turned to the tourists. "Well, I hope you guys got your money's worth," he said, laughing awkwardly, but the mood had shifted. The tourists were quiet now, their faces pale with the realization that something was very wrong. That night, around the campfire, my dad's friend wouldn't say much about what had happened. He was quiet, distracted. Every time my dad or uncle asked him what was going on, he only gave vague, cryptic answers. "It killed them, and now it's going to try and kill me," he said, his voice distant. He wouldn't explain any further. Instead, he handed my dad and uncle each a small piece of wood, like the one he had shown the coyote. It had the same arrow burned into it. He said that these pieces of wood would protect them from the creature, whatever it was, and that he had made them himself. My dad didn't understand at the time, but he took the pieces, mostly out of respect. The next morning, my dad's friend was gone. He had left the camp before dawn, driving off without a word. My dad and uncle never saw him again. There was no explanation, just the pieces of what he left behind and the memory of the strange coyote. Years later, my dad would tell me the story, usually when we were out camping in the woods. He'd laugh about it, telling it like it was just another funny story. But sometimes, late at night when the wind was blowing through the trees and the sound of rustling leaves filled the air, my dad would go quiet. I'd notice a look in his eyes, a sort of distant recognition. "I can still hear that thing sometimes," he'd say, his voice soft. "That low howl. It doesn't sound like a coyote anymore, not really. But it's out there. It's always out there." Even as a kid, I could sense that there was more to the story than what my dad let on. There was something that unsettled him about it, something he couldn't fully explain. But whatever it was, I could tell it had been something my dad didn't want to face again. That strange coyote, and the man who had warned him about it, had left a mark on him. A mark that never fully faded, no matter how much time passed. I don't know what my dad's friend saw that day, or why the coyote had followed them. But I can say this: I've spent a lot of time out in the woods, and I've heard a lot of animal sounds in my life. But there's nothing that sounds like that coyote's howl. It's a sound I'll never forget. And sometimes, when I'm out camping, late at night when the wind picks up and the trees start to rustle, I can almost hear it. That low, gurgling howl, like something not quite alive is trying to scream. It always sends a chill down my spine. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's just the wind. But deep down, I wonder if that coyote, whatever it was, is still out there waiting. And if it is, I'm not sure I ever want to find out why it was following us that day. Some things, I think, are better left unexplained. When I was older, I asked my dad if he ever saw that friend again. He just shook his head, staring off into the distance, like he was still hearing that howl in his mind. "No," he said quietly. "I never saw him again, and I don't want to." And I think that was all my dad ever really needed to say about it. Some things, once they're gone, are better left in the past, no matter how much we might want to understand them. I think my dad figured that out long before I did. My entire life feels like a dark, twisted tale of control, fear, and loneliness. From the moment I could remember, my world was shaped by an overwhelming, suffocating protection that left me trapped in a small, isolated bubble. My mother and grandmother had a strange, iron grip on me, one that I couldn't break free from no matter how much I tried. It wasn't like they were evil, not in the way most people would imagine. They didn't yell at me all the time or abuse me in the traditional sense. But they controlled every inch of my life in such a subtle, insidious way that I never even realized how deeply it was affecting me until I was older, much older. It was always done with care, with love, they would say. But the truth was, it was a prison I couldn't escape. I remember being very young, around 7 or 8, and asking my mother if I could go play with the other kids in the neighborhood. She looked at me with a serious, almost pitying gaze, as though she couldn't understand why I would want to go outside and mingle with others. I had no idea why she didn't want me to go, but she gave me a soft pat on my head, saying, "No, sweetie, you don't need to play with them. You have everything you need here with us. We'll take care of you." It was the way she said it that made me trust her, that made me believe her words. As the years went by, the rules became stricter. I was forbidden to walk down the street to a friend's house. I couldn't even go for a simple walk around the block. It was always, "It's too dangerous outside," or "You never know who you'll run into." I wasn't allowed to visit family members either. My cousins would invite me over, but my mother would always come up with some excuse. Either I was too young, or they had dangerous pets, or I just didn't need to be out there with them. Even my own relatives who would visit us seemed to accept the fact that I was kept inside, under lock and key. Cooking. That was another one of those "you don't need to" situations. My mother would prepare every meal and every snack. I wasn't allowed to use the stove, the microwave, or even the toaster. She didn't trust me to handle it. "It's safer this way," she'd say, and I believed her. Why wouldn't I? She was my mother. She knew what was best for me, right? The same went for driving. I never learned how to drive. I wasn't allowed to. Even at 19, when my friends were all getting their licenses and planning their first road trips, I was still stuck in the house. My mother didn't let me get a job either. She told me I didn't need one. She said, "Why would you want to work when everything you need is here? You don't need money. It was bizarre, looking back now, that I didn't see how strange it was, how controlling it was. But at the time, it felt normal. I didn't question it. I didn't think I could. By then, I had no real friends. I had no life outside the house. I was isolated. I'd been isolated for so long that I didn't even know how to talk to people anymore. I had no job, no school, no activities. Just the walls of my home, my mother's watchful eye, and the strange sense that there was something wrong with me. I could feel the weight of it, deep in my chest, but I couldn't articulate it. I didn't even know where to start. What I did know was that something had to change. I was suffocating. One day, I finally cracked. I couldn't take it anymore. I had a breaking point, and I decided I would leave. I had secretly saved up some money over the months. Little bits here and there, from doing laundry for neighbors, finding loose change around the house, swiping what I could when no one was looking. I had to hide it well, though. If my mother found out, she would take it. She told me all money belonged to her. It was her money, and anything I earned would be hers too. But this time, I was determined. I would get out. I packed my bags, took the money I had, and waited for the right moment. I remember that day so clearly. I waited until my mother went to bed, and then I made my move. My heart was racing as I grabbed my things, tiptoed through the house, and quietly snuck out the door. But the moment I stepped onto the porch, I felt a heavy hand on my shoulder. My mother's voice, cold and hard, whispered in my ear. "Where do you think you're going?" I froze. She had somehow known. She was always watching, always there. She grabbed my arm, and before I could react, she tackled me to the ground. She wasn't alone. My grandmother was there too. They both dragged me back inside, their grip tight and unforgiving. My heart pounded in my chest. My mind was spinning. I couldn't believe it was happening. I thought I was free, but I was wrong. My grandmother helped her lock the door behind me, and I could hear the faint sound of my phone being taken away. They had it reported as stolen, so I couldn't use it to call for help. I couldn't reach out to anyone. And worse, they set up a bed beside mine. My mother didn't leave me alone for a second. She slept beside me, her body just inches away from mine, making sure I didn't even try to sneak out. Days turned into weeks. The walls of my prison closed in tighter. I felt like I was losing my mind. I tried to scream, tried to fight back, but they always had an answer for everything. When I tried to leave again, my mother took me to a church meeting. It wasn't a regular church. It was a holiness church. I didn't understand it at the time, but now I realize how manipulative it was. They prayed over me for hours. For 3 hours straight, they tried to bless the demons out of me. They claimed I was possessed, that I needed help. They had convinced the entire congregation that I was a lost cause, a person who needed saving. I was just a frightened, confused girl, and they treated me like I was some sort of broken thing. No one in that church cared enough to question my mother. No one even looked at me like I was a person with thoughts, with feelings. They all just assumed that I needed their prayers, their blessings. But they didn't see the truth. They didn't see the way my mother controlled every part of my life. They didn't see the scars she had left inside me. The next time I tried to leave, it was even worse. My mother recruited my cousin to help her. He came to me with a story about how she was worried about me, about how I needed to get in the car so we could talk. It sounded so normal, so calm. But when I got into the car, he shut the door on me. There was a child safety lock on it. I couldn't escape. I screamed, I banged on the window, but he drove me back home. He didn't say a word. He just kept driving, and I knew there was no way out. Back at home, things got even worse. My relatives started parking their cars in the driveway, making sure I couldn't leave. It was like a never-ending game of cat and mouse. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't break free. I was trapped, but something shifted in me after that year. I realized that if I didn't do something soon, I would lose myself completely. I had been broken down, humiliated, and isolated for so long, but I was still alive. I still had my will. I just had to find the strength to fight back. Slowly, I started to push back. At first, it was little things. I would sneak small moments of independence. I would read in secret. I'd go to the bathroom and lock the door just to have a moment of privacy. It was pathetic, really, but it was all I could manage. I knew that if I wanted to survive, I had to start small. Over time, I found a way to talk to people outside my family. I reached out to a counselor who helped me find a way to get a restraining order. It wasn't easy. I had to get the courage to tell someone what had happened, to expose the way my family had held me captive. But I did it. I broke free. It wasn't instant. It wasn't easy, but I started to rebuild my life. I moved into a small apartment, far away from the house that had held me hostage for so long. I found a job. I made new friends. Slowly, the world opened up to me again. The road to recovery wasn't easy. The guilt, the shame, the fear, those things didn't vanish overnight. But every day, I felt a little bit stronger. I still don't speak to my mother or grandmother. I'm still working through the scars they left on me. But I'm free now. Free to make my own choices, to live my own life. It's hard to describe the weight that lifted when I finally walked out the door for the last time. I'm not sure I'll ever fully heal from what they did to me. But I know one thing for sure. I will never let anyone control me again. I remember the house we lived in when I was 10 years old in Thailand. It wasn't like any other house I'd ever seen. My sister and I shared a room upstairs, a simple room with 2 beds and a small window that overlooked the backyard. It was a large house, one of those old, traditional Thai houses, with wooden floors that creaked when you walked across them and high ceilings that were always hot and stuffy. It felt like the house had a life of its own, an energy that I didn't fully understand at the time. There was a room next to ours that was supposed to be a guest bedroom, but it was always empty. The door to that room was always shut, and there was a Jack and Jill bathroom between it and our bedroom. The bathroom had an old wooden door with a brass handle that looked like it belonged in a different century. But we never went in that room, not once. I don't know why, but it always felt wrong. My sister and I would always play in our room or downstairs, but we never stepped foot in the guest room, and neither did the maid. We had a maid who would come every day. She was older than my mom, and she had a stern way about her. I remember how she would always yell at us for leaving the ceiling fan on in our room. She'd say, "You'll waste electricity." But no matter how many times we turned it off, it always seemed to be on when she came in to clean. It was always a point of tension between us. But honestly, that wasn't the most unsettling thing about the house. The house itself had a presence, something I couldn't put into words at the time. But looking back, I know it was there. There was something heavy in the air, something that made the walls feel closer than they were. The strangest thing was that the house was always so quiet. It was a large, empty house with a lot of space, and yet there were always noises. At night, after we'd go to bed, I'd hear it, the sound of children laughing and running around upstairs. It wasn't just a random noise. It was rhythmic, like kids playing, running back and forth, their footsteps echoing off the wooden floors above. The sound of bouncing balls would follow, and you could hear them thudding against the walls. But the problem was there was no one upstairs. No one in the guest room, no one in our room. It was just us, my sister and me, and the maid, who was usually downstairs cleaning. One night, we decided to have a sleepover. We invited our friend over, someone from the neighborhood who had spent the night before, but this time we were going to make it special. We had the idea to make a blanket tent in the empty guest room. The room was large, and the space felt empty and cold even with the blankets draped over the furniture. We dragged blankets, pillows, and sheets into the room and set up our little fort in the center. We left the lights off and just sat there talking, whispering to each other, trying to make each other laugh. It was supposed to be fun, a way to enjoy our time together. But something felt off. Even in the middle of our laughter, there was an underlying tension in the room, like someone was watching us. I could feel it in my chest. I remember the way the air suddenly grew thick, and how the shadows seemed to shift around us. The room, despite being empty, felt full of something I couldn't explain. We laughed it off at first, thinking it was just our imagination. But then, I heard something that froze my blood. There was a noise, soft at first, like something scratching the wall. It wasn't the sound of fingernails or a loose board creaking. It was much softer, like something was dragging against the plaster. My sister and our friend heard it too, and for a moment, none of us moved. We just stared at the wall, waiting for it to stop, hoping it was just a rodent or the house settling. But then it happened again, only louder, and this time it didn't stop. It continued for what felt like an eternity. We were too scared to move, our breaths shallow and fast, eyes wide in the dimness. Suddenly, the armoire in the room, the one that had been sitting silently in the corner, creaked. The doors slowly, agonizingly slowly, began to open. It wasn't the kind of sound you expect from an old piece of furniture, where the hinges squeak with age. No, this was a low, ominous sound, like the door was fighting to open against something. My heart pounded in my chest. The three of us were frozen, staring at the door, not sure whether we should run or stay. I remember the weight of the air, the stillness of the room, and how we could hear the creaking sound of the door like it was happening in slow motion. Then, without thinking, without even talking, all three of us bolted out of the room. We ran down the stairs and into the living room, our hearts racing, breath coming in sharp gasps. We didn't speak. We couldn't. The fear was too much to put into words. I remember how we huddled in the living room, the TV on but no one watching. The room felt colder now, even though the fan in the other room was still running. We didn't go back to the guest room that night, and we didn't stay in the house alone for a long time after that. It was like something had changed in that room, something we couldn't explain. The next day, we told our parents what had happened. They didn't seem to believe us, but they didn't brush us off either. They just chalked it up to us being scared, or to the house as old with making strange noises. But I knew what we had heard. I knew what we had felt. There was something in that house, something that wasn't just the wind or the house settling. And I wasn't the only one who felt it. It wasn't until later, when we were talking to some local people about the area, that we learned the truth about the swamp behind our backyard. The swamp wasn't just a body of water, a marshy area that smelled like stagnant water and rotting vegetation. According to the locals, it was a place where babies were often abandoned. I don't know how true it was, but the way they said it made my skin crawl. They said that in the past, people would go there to leave their unwanted children. The swamp was hidden from view, tucked behind trees and overgrown plants, but the thought of what might have happened there made my stomach turn. I couldn't shake the image of those innocent lives, abandoned and left to die in that dark, murky water. The house was sold not long after that. My parents decided it was time to move, but it wasn't just the noises or the coldness in the air that made them leave. It was the feeling that something had been left behind, something that couldn't be explained. And though we moved out, the memory of that house, of the sounds we heard and the things we felt, stayed with me for a long time. I could never shake the feeling that the house had been a place where something terrible had happened, something that lingered long after the people were gone. To this day, I don't know if it was the house, the swamp, or something else entirely. But I do know that whatever it was, it left its mark on me. And I'll never forget the way the air felt that night, the way the shadows seemed to move, and the sound of the armoire door creaking open. Some things can never be explained, and some things, no matter how hard you try, you can never forget. I was in my mid-20s, just finishing a long day at work. I didn't mind the walk home from my office. It was a little over a mile, and even though it was a busy road, I usually felt safe. I liked to take a shortcut through the local park, especially in the summer. The days were long, and the park was full of people, families, joggers, people walking their dogs, or just sitting on benches reading or enjoying the sunshine. It was a nice break from the hustle of the city streets, and I found the short walk through it relaxing. This particular day, however, felt different. It was bright and sunny, with not a cloud in the sky, but there was something about the air that made my skin crawl. I brushed it off at first, telling myself I was just tired from a long day, but the uneasy feeling lingered as I made my way across the park. There was a small gate in the middle of the park that led out to the road, and it was the quickest route home. It was a regular part of my walk, and I never thought twice about it. But today, as I approached, I noticed two youngish Asian guys standing right in front of the gate. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe they were just passing through or hanging out. But then I got closer and saw that they weren't moving. They were just standing there, kind of blocking the entrance. Something about their posture didn't sit right with me. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was enough to make me pause for a moment. My instincts screamed at me to turn around and take the longer way home, but I shook it off. Don't be silly, I told myself. It's just a couple of guys. You've walked through here 100 times. I told myself it was nothing and kept walking, but the unease in my gut was growing stronger. I could feel my heart rate pick up, and I realized I was walking a little faster now, without really meaning to. As I approached the gate, one of the guys suddenly moved out of my line of sight. I didn't think much of it at first, but then the other guy shouted at me, "Hey, you got the time." His voice was loud, a little too loud, and it made my skin prickle. It felt forced, like he was trying to get my attention, but in a way that didn't seem natural. As I took another step forward, I saw the guy who had disappeared earlier. He was now crouching down behind some bushes nearby. The sight of him like that sent a chill down my spine. I kept walking, but my pace quickened. I could feel my body tensing, my mind racing. My eyes darted around, scanning the area. That's when I noticed the car parked next to them. It wasn't a fancy car, just a nondescript sedan, but there were two other guys crouched beside it, partly hidden behind the vehicle. It hit me like a punch in the stomach. Something was wrong. Everything about this situation felt wrong. My instincts were screaming at me now, telling me to get out of there, to get away before it was too late. I didn't think, I just reacted. My body surged into motion, and I did an about-turn, walking briskly in the opposite direction. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my legs moving faster than they ever had in the park. I didn't dare look behind me, but I could hear the guy shouting again. "Oi, oi, what's the time?" The words echoed through the air, but they didn't sound the same as before. This time, his voice had a sharper edge to it, like a command rather than a casual question. It was a taunt, an invitation to keep moving forward, to get closer. I sped up, my feet pounding the pavement. I didn't stop to look back, but I could feel the fear growing in me with every step. I knew they were still watching me, still paying attention. It felt like they were moving, getting closer, closing the distance between us. My adrenaline surged as I quickly approached another exit from the park, a path that led to the busy road. I couldn't wait to get out of the park, to get back to the main streets, where people were around and I could blend into the crowd. When I finally reached the road, I felt a small sense of relief, but it wasn't enough. I could still feel my heart racing, my hands shaking. I kept walking, faster now, my pace steady but not panicked. But even as I walked, the fear didn't leave. The thought of those guys lurking in the park, of what might have happened if I hadn't turned around, haunted me. My stomach was in knots, my chest tight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. By the time I reached my apartment, I was almost running. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking so badly that it took me several tries to get the door open. When I finally stepped inside, I locked the door behind me and stood there for a moment, trying to catch my breath. My whole body felt like it was buzzing with adrenaline, but I couldn't stop shaking. I couldn't stop thinking about what could have happened if I had kept walking, if I hadn't listened to that gut feeling, that nagging voice telling me something was wrong. It wasn't until much later that I fully realized what had almost happened. I'm not sure if it was intentional, but I've never been more convinced that I narrowly avoided being targeted that day. I don't know what their plan was, whether they were going to rob me, threaten me, or something far worse, but I knew that if I had kept walking, I might not have been able to get away. I told myself it was just a close call, but it felt like so much more. The fear lingered for days after, and it wasn't just the memory of the encounter that haunted me. It was the realization of how easily things could have gone wrong. It was a reminder of how dangerous the world can be, how quickly a situation can shift from ordinary to terrifying. I didn't take that shortcut through the park again for a long time. I kept to the main streets, where there were more people, more eyes, more safety. It wasn't until weeks later that I felt ready to take the park again, but by then, I was always hyper-aware, always looking around, always on edge. Even though it was broad daylight, even though there were people around, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had barely escaped a situation I wasn't prepared for. I'll never know exactly what they were planning or why they were there that day, but I don't need to. The fear that washed over me when I turned around, when I realized what I was walking into, is something I'll never forget. It was the gut instinct that saved me, the little voice that told me to turn around, and it's a lesson I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. In third grade, everything felt big and new and a little overwhelming. I was still figuring out how to tie my shoes quickly enough to not get embarrassed in gym class, and I still thought bringing a Lunchable to school made me cool. That year, I had a teacher named Mrs. Todd. She was short, maybe the shortest adult I had ever met up until that point. Not tiny like a kid, but noticeably shorter than all the other teachers. She had round cheeks and wore thick glasses, and she was always smiling. Always. She wore long dresses that swayed when she walked, and her voice was soft, gentle, always warm. I remember how her perfume smelled. It was powdery and sweet, like lavender or something close to it, and even now, years later, every time I pass someone wearing something similar, my stomach tightens without me knowing why at first. Back then, I thought she was the nicest adult I'd ever met. I honestly loved her. I used to come home and tell my mom all about her. I told her that Mrs. Todd always picked me first when we played games in class. When we had to act out little skits or read out loud, she'd always call on me to go first. She always said my handwriting was beautiful, even though it really wasn't. She'd draw little hearts next to my name on the top of my papers. At the time, I thought she just liked me because I was a good student. I was quiet, never caused problems, and always tried hard. It made sense in my young mind. I liked her back, probably more than I ever liked any teacher before or since. There was a weird sort of comfort in how much she smiled at me, how she talked to me like I was more mature than the other kids. It made me feel important. The first few months of that year were normal, nothing out of the ordinary. But I remember things slowly started to feel different. It wasn't obvious at first, just small things. Like one time, I had forgotten my homework at home, and I was panicking. I was near tears, thinking I'd get in trouble. But Mrs. Todd didn't even mark me down. She knelt beside my desk and whispered that it was okay, that she believed me, and that I didn't need to worry. Then she told me, "Mistakes happen to the best of us," and gave me a little wink. That felt nice back then. It made me feel special, like I had someone looking out for me. But the thing is, she didn't treat the other kids the same way. If they forgot homework, they got a mark. If they acted up even slightly, they'd get told to sit out during recess or write lines. I never got punished, even when I probably deserved it. One time, I accidentally knocked over a tub of crayons and made a mess all over the floor. She smiled, told me not to worry, and cleaned it up herself. Looking back, I should have realized something was off, but I didn't. I was 8. I thought I was just lucky. Then came the magazine. It was a Friday, I think. I came in a little earlier than usual because my mom had a dentist appointment that morning and dropped me off before the bell. The classroom was quiet, mostly empty except for a few kids. I went to my desk and opened the pull-out drawer to put my folders away. And there it was, a Victoria's Secret magazine. I didn't know exactly what it was at the time. Not really, but I knew enough to feel weird about it. It was one of those glossy catalogs with women in underwear and swimsuits on the cover. I remember just staring at it for a few seconds, not even touching it, wondering if maybe I had opened the wrong desk. But no, it was mine. My name was written on the top with a strip of masking tape, the way we labeled everything. I must have looked shocked because the kid next to me, Marcus, leaned over and saw it too. He laughed a little and asked me where I got it from. I just stared at it, feeling like I was already in trouble. Like it didn't matter if I'd never seen it before. I was going to get blamed. That's when Mrs. Todd came over. I don't know how she noticed so quickly, but it was like she was watching me from the moment I walked in. She knelt down, looked into my desk, and saw the magazine. Then she said something like, "What have you got there?" I told her it was already in there when I sat down. I remember my voice sounded really small. I was scared. I didn't want to get detention or have to call my parents. Mrs. Todd's face didn't change. She smiled the same way as always, but it felt wrong. She turned to Marcus and said that he must have put it there. Repeated it, over and over. "You must have done this," or "You probably thought it would be funny." I remember sitting there frozen, not saying anything. Marcus kept saying it wasn't him, and I believed him, but Mrs. Todd just kept repeating herself until it stopped feeling like a question and started sounding like a statement. Eventually, I nodded. I didn't even know why I did. Maybe I just wanted her to stop looking at me that way. After that, the magazine disappeared. Nobody got in real trouble for it. Not even Marcus, thankfully. But it sat in my head for days after. Something about it just didn't feel right. A few days later, something else happened. Class had just ended, and most of the kids were packing up to go home. I was zipping up my backpack when Mrs. Todd called me over to her desk. She smiled again, like always, and told me that I was doing really well in class. She said I was a good student, mature, responsible. I smiled and said thanks. Then she said something strange. She told me that if I kept up the good work, there might be a special reward soon. A private field trip, she said. Just her and me. She said we could go down to the Gulf of Mexico for a weekend. She said she had a little spot she liked to go to, and she'd love to show it to me. That she thought I would enjoy it, because I was special. She made it sound like it was the most normal thing in the world. And I believed her. I didn't know how weird that was. I didn't know that teachers weren't supposed to take students anywhere outside of school, let alone for a whole weekend. I didn't know any of that. I was just excited. I nodded and said I'd try my best. Later that night, I told my mom about it. I told her Mrs. Todd said I might get to go on a trip if I stayed good. She didn't say anything at first, just kind of looked at me and asked me to repeat what I said. So I did. She asked if the whole class was going, and I told her no, just me. That Mrs. Todd picked me because I was doing so well. She got really quiet after that. I didn't understand the look on her face then, but I do now. Back then, it just seemed like she was confused. She didn't say much else, just told me it was time for dinner. The next week, Mrs. Todd was gone. There was no warning, no explanation. One day she was there, and the next day we had a substitute. The day after that, they introduced a new teacher. Her name was Miss Donaldson. She wasn't as nice. She wasn't mean either, but she didn't give out compliments or little prizes or anything like that. She treated everyone the same. I didn't understand what had happened. No one ever explained it. I asked one of the other kids if they knew where Mrs. Todd went, and they shrugged. Nobody seemed to know. I was heartbroken. For a long time, I thought it was my fault. I thought maybe I had said something wrong. Maybe I hadn't been good enough to go on the field trip. Maybe she just didn't like the class anymore and went to teach somewhere else. I cried a few times when I got home. I didn't know how to process it. The closest thing I could compare it to was when one of my old friends moved away and didn't come back after summer break. It wasn't until years later that I understood. It didn't hit me all at once. It came in pieces slowly across time. First, when I was in middle school, we had a health class that talked about boundaries and safe adults. We were shown I was 4 years old when the crash happened, but I still remember it. Or rather, I remember hearing about it a lot. I don't have any memories of my father, not a single moment of him really. When my parents split, I was just too young to hold on to anything clear about him. There's something strange about that, knowing that someone was such a huge part of your life, but you can't remember them. It's like a hole that you know exists but can never fill, no matter how hard you try. The crash itself, I have no memory of it. The event happened on Highway 84, somewhere between Lubbock and Abilene in West Texas. My father, stepmother, and baby brother were all killed. They were on their way from Albuquerque to Houston to pick me up. I had no idea they were coming for me, and I had no idea that it would be the last time I'd hear from them. From what I've pieced together over the years, it was a simple enough stop. They pulled over to check on my baby brother, who was having a fit in the back seat. Maybe they thought the noise was too much, or maybe it was just an instinct to make sure he was okay. But that's when it happened. A semi-truck driver, who had been driving for hours beyond what he should have, veered onto the shoulder and hit their car. He was going downhill at about 70 miles per hour when he made contact. No one in my family survived. The crash was catastrophic. Fire engulfed the car almost immediately. The semi-driver lived, though, which I still don't fully understand. Growing up, I was told about the accident, but it never felt real to me. After all, I was only 4. I didn't even know my father well enough to feel the loss. But as I got older, the stories of that crash stayed with me. I didn't know how to deal with it. I didn't know how to mourn for people I couldn't remember. And when I finally left home to go to college at Texas Tech in Lubbock, I found myself passing by that same stretch of highway all the time. Each trip to and from DFW, I'd pass the spot where my family died. It felt like a strange connection, but I never stopped to think about it. I couldn't. It was too heavy. It wasn't until later, when I started doing some research, that the weight of it all really sank in. I found an article online about the accident. It described a person who had witnessed the crash. They had been living in a house nearby at the time and had called for help when they saw what had happened. That part wasn't so strange. What struck me, though, was the next part of the article. The person had described seeing my family, my father, stepmother, and baby brother, walking along the side of the highway. They were just walking. They didn't seem to be in any kind of hurry, but they were walking as if they were continuing their journey, heading somewhere, anywhere. The person in the article didn't know them, but they said they could see them clearly. The person even went so far as to say that it was as if they were trapped in a kind of limbo, walking but never getting any closer to their destination. It was one of the strangest things I've ever read. That hit me harder than I expected. My family was heading toward me. They were on their way to pick me up, and they were just gone. There was no closure, no real goodbye. I didn't know how to handle it. I sat there reading the article for a long time, just staring at the words, feeling something I couldn't explain. I cried. I didn't expect to cry, not for them, not for people I didn't even remember. But there it was. I broke down, and for the first time, I felt the loss in a way I never had before. I kept thinking about that description of them walking. It felt like a connection to something I couldn't reach, something I couldn't even really understand. How is it that this person saw my family walking, and why did they never seem to reach their destination? It didn't make sense, but it kept me up at night, wondering if they had truly been trapped in some kind of purgatory. I know that sounds like some kind of spooky ghost story, but it wasn't like that. It wasn't supernatural, just the weight of knowing that they never made it. I wasn't sure what to do with this new information. It stayed with me for weeks, haunting me in a way that nothing else had. And that's when I decided to try to find the spot of the accident. It felt like the only way I could make some sense of it. Maybe I could pay respects, show some kind of acknowledgement for what had happened, for what I had lost. I asked some locals about the accident, and to my surprise, they remembered it. The crash had been a big deal in the area. People still talked about it, especially those who had witnessed it or helped afterward. They gave me directions to the general spot. When I finally got there, I parked my car and sat for a moment. The highway stretched out in both directions, empty and quiet. The wind blew dust across the road, and the only sound was the faint hum of the occasional car driving by in the distance. It felt like any other stretch of highway in West Texas, but for me, it was everything. It was the spot where my family had died, where my life had been changed in an instant. I sat there in silence, just staring at the road, trying to make sense of it all. It was strange, being so close to something that had always felt so distant. I didn't have memories of my father or my stepmother or my baby brother, but they were there. They were always there, in the back of my mind, in the way people talk about their lost loved ones. I felt the weight of that loss in a way I hadn't before. It was overwhelming, like a wave that I couldn't outrun. But at the same time, there was something peaceful about it. Like I was finally letting myself acknowledge the past and the people I had lost. I took a deep breath and stood up. I didn't have much to say. I wasn't sure I needed to, but I felt like I had to do something. I wasn't going to let this part of my life slip away without recognizing it. I didn't know if it would help me heal or if it would make things worse, but I needed to be there. I needed to honor them, even if I didn't know them, even if I couldn't remember them. So I stood in the middle of the highway, just for a moment, and said goodbye. It wasn't for them, it was for me. After that, I left. I drove back to Lubbock, back to my life. But I've never really stopped thinking about it. I've never stopped thinking about them. The strange thing about it all is that, even now, I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, walking along the side of the highway, never reaching their destination. And maybe that's just the way it is, the way it's always going to be. We can never really go back, no matter how hard we try. We just keep moving forward, whether we're ready or not. And that's the hardest part, moving on. Because no matter what, no matter how much time passes, I'll never really have those memories of them. And that's something I'll never be able to change. I'd been living in my first apartment alone for about 2 weeks. It was a basement apartment, which meant it was cheap, really cheap. I could see why it was so affordable, though. The windows were right at ground level, so people could walk by and see right into the place if they looked in. And trust me, a lot of people walked by. It wasn't a bad neighborhood, but it wasn't the best either. My apartment was one of those quirky places, the kind you don't mind because you're young and just starting out, and you're willing to make do with a few things that weren't quite perfect. Plus, it had potential, or at least, that's what I told myself. There were 2 bedrooms, though I only used one of them. The other one was a storage room at the moment, stacked with empty boxes I hadn't bothered to unpack yet. The room itself was a little weird. The window had water damage, which I didn't know how to fix, so I kept the blinds pulled all the way up to let the sunlight in and dry it out a bit. I wasn't a fan of it looking all dark and grimy, but at least it made the space feel a little more airy. That room had nothing in it except those stacked boxes, though. It was bare. One night, after a long day at work, I fell asleep quickly. I'd been so exhausted that I barely remembered drifting off. But I woke up suddenly, completely awake. I can't even explain it, but my body was immediately on edge. It wasn't like a normal waking up from a dream kind of feeling. It was as though every nerve in my body was hyper alert, and my heart was already pounding in my chest, like it knew something was wrong. I glanced at my phone, groggy but not fully asleep anymore. It was 4 a.m. I tried to shake off the feeling, but I couldn't. My body was restless, and my mind kept replaying everything that had happened today, even though there was nothing out of the ordinary. No strange noises or unsettling encounters. Still, I couldn't shake it. I turned my head toward the window. My bedroom window was still closed, and the blinds were shut tight. But something caught my attention. A shadow. A big one. It was hard to make out at first, but it was there. A silhouette of someone standing outside, just on the other side of the glass, moving slowly. The shadow was dark and massive, and I could see the faint beam of a flashlight flicking from side to side, searching. It was scanning my window. I froze. My mind raced. What the hell was going on? Was this some kind of joke? No way. Who the hell would be outside at 4 a.m., shining a light into my window? I didn't move a muscle at first. The shadow stayed there, still as a rock, the flashlight shifting around. Then, something else happened. I heard the sound of keys jingling. Not a lot, but enough for me to hear. They jingled softly, as though they were in the person's pocket, or maybe they were just fumbling with them. Whoever it was, they were big. The shape was solid, heavy, and the boots they wore were clunky, scraping against the ground as they shifted. The flashlight moved a little more frantically now. They were scanning the ground outside my window. The sound of their footsteps came closer, and my heartbeat echoed in my ears. I felt the adrenaline surge through my veins. Panic started to bubble up, but I wasn't going to just sit there and wait. I wasn't that person. I grabbed a small hunting knife I'd had since college, one I'd picked up on a camping trip. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. It was all I had. Quietly, I moved through the dark apartment, trying not to make a sound. My steps were light, and I made sure to keep the knife hidden in my hand, just in case. The hallway was dim, lit only by the glow of the streetlights outside that seeped through the blinds. I crept toward the other bedroom, the one with the open window. As I passed the door, I glanced inside. That room felt like the most vulnerable place in the apartment. The blinds were pulled all the way up, the water damage exposing the inner workings of the window frame. But now, it was too late to fix anything. I had no choice but to look out of that window. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and peeked around the corner. The person outside was still there. They weren't just standing anymore. The flashlight beam was moving slowly along the floor of my room, scanning the space. I could see it clearly now, their heavy boots, their bulk. The keys jingled again. The person was tall, bigger than most people, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. They had no idea I was watching. I felt a burst of terror shoot through me. This wasn't a random passerby, and this wasn't a prank. I didn't know who it was, but I knew I wasn't safe. I started to think of every worst-case scenario. I'd heard stories about break-ins and robberies, about women being targeted in situations like mine. I had to act. But what if I couldn't? What if I wasn't strong enough? I quietly backed away from the door, every muscle tensed. I couldn't let this person know I was home, but I couldn't stay hidden in my room either. I needed help, but I didn't know who to turn to. No one was supposed to be here. I was alone, and the knife in my hand suddenly felt too small, too fragile. I wished I had a better weapon. I wished I had a way to defend myself properly. Then, just as I was about to make a move, my phone buzzed. The text was from a friend I knew from the police force. My stomach churned. "What's going on at your apartment?" My heart stopped. What did they know? How? Was it them? Had they seen what was happening? I typed back quickly, my fingers shaking. "I don't know, but someone is outside my window, trying to get in. What the hell is going on?" There was a long pause before my friend replied. I could feel the seconds ticking by, dragging out. What if they couldn't help in time? I waited, tense and on edge, unable to take my eyes off the person outside. The flashlight was still moving around the floor, still scanning, as though they were trying to find something. My heart raced faster. The waiting was agonizing. Was I about to face a stranger in my apartment? Was this the moment everything went wrong? Then, suddenly, the shadow outside moved away. The flashlight flickered off, and the figure stepped back into the darkness. My breath caught in my throat. They were gone. I didn't know whether to feel relief or fear. They could come back. They could be planning something. I quickly texted my friend again. "Are you sure it's not an intruder? Someone is in my yard." It felt like an eternity before my phone buzzed again. "Don't worry, I'll be over in a few minutes." I didn't know what to think. What was going on? I didn't have time to wait around anymore. Maybe this was all just a misunderstanding. but I wasn't willing to take any chances. As I lay down on my bed, trying to calm my racing thoughts, I heard it, a loud knock at my door. A single knock, followed by another. It was forceful, too hard to ignore. I felt the panic start to rise again, like a wave crashing in. What if it was the person from outside? What if they had a weapon now, ready to break in? I had no peephole, no safety chain on my door, just a simple deadbolt. The thought of opening it made my stomach churn. My spoon. I couldn't just ignore the knock. If it was an emergency, I couldn't leave it unanswered. I called out from behind the door, my voice shaky but loud enough to carry. "Who is it?" There was a brief pause before the voice replied. "It's the police," they said. The voice sounded distant, almost too calm. "We need to speak with you." I froze. My heart dropped. Was this a trick? A plan to get me to open the door? Who the hell knocks that hard at 4 a.m. and then claims to be the police? I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. The seconds felt like minutes. Should I open the door? What if they were lying? Then, the voice came again, this time softer. "You're not in trouble. We just need to talk." I hesitated, but something in me told me I needed to act fast. I cautiously opened the door just a crack, enough to see who was on the other side. There were two men standing there, both wearing uniforms, one standing a little further back from the door. "Ma'am, we apologize for the scare," one of them said. "We were the ones looking in your windows." I blinked in disbelief. "What?" They explained quickly. It turned out there had been a mix-up. A neighbor from my apartment complex had gotten drunk, lost his keys, and ended up trying to get into his own apartment by breaking in through a window. In his drunken state, he thought it was mine. They had been looking through my window, trying to figure out if it was his apartment or not. That's why they had the flashlight and were scanning the floor. They'd thought something was off because there was no sign of a broken window. I stood there, dumbfounded. The adrenaline started to fade, and the exhaustion from the last few hours hit me all at once. I wanted to cry. I wanted to scream. I'd been terrified for nothing, but in that moment, it didn't feel like nothing. My body had been convinced something was wrong. I'd been ready to fight for my life. The cops apologized again, told me to stay safe, and left. I closed the door and locked it immediately. I couldn't believe what had just happened. The whole thing had felt so real, so terrifying, and yet it wasn't. I couldn't sleep for hours after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow outside my window. But over time, the fear faded, and I realized something. I had survived. And even though the situation had been terrifying, it was something I could look back on and laugh about eventually. I'd been scared for my life. But sometimes, that fear saved me from a bigger mistake. And I wasn't about to let it make me paranoid in the future. I can still remember that morning as if it happened yesterday. It was a typical fall day in early October. The air was crisp, and the sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting long shadows over the quiet suburban neighborhood. The house was still and peaceful, the kind of calm that makes you forget about the world outside. My cousin Dan and his wife Sarah had lived in their home for about 5 years at that point. It wasn't a mansion, but it was theirs. A modest 2-story house with a small front yard, a white picket fence, and a few trees lining the property. They had a baby, a little boy named Ethan, who had just turned 1 a few months earlier. The house was their sanctuary, a place where they thought they could raise their son in peace and quiet, away from any sort of danger. That morning, Sarah had gotten up a bit later than usual. She had been up half the night with the baby, and it had been a struggle to get him to fall asleep. Dan had already left for work early in the morning, like he always did, so Sarah was left to handle things on her own. She went through the usual morning routine, making coffee, changing the baby's diaper, feeding him, and getting ready for work herself. After she finished getting Ethan ready, she took him to daycare. But as she was pulling out of the driveway, she realized she had forgotten her phone. It wasn't uncommon for Sarah to be a little forgetful in the mornings, especially when it came to juggling so many tasks with a young child. But she didn't think anything of it at the time. She turned the car around, drove back home, and parked in the driveway. She walked into the house, calling out as she entered. The front door clicked shut behind her, and she began walking down the hallway towards the living room, thinking she'd grab her phone from the kitchen counter. As she turned the corner, she froze. There, right in front of her, was the attic ladder. The one that dropped down from the ceiling, leading to the dusty and used attic space above the house. The ladder was fully extended. It was hanging down in the middle of the hallway, right in her path. Now, the attic was a place neither Dan nor Sarah ever used. It was filled with loose insulation, boxes of old holiday decorations, and other forgotten odds and ends that had accumulated over the years. They had never bothered to go up there, and the attic was in no shape to be used as extra storage. The ladder had never been down before. In fact, Sarah couldn't even remember the last time she had seen it at all. It was always tucked up into the ceiling, out of sight and mind. But there it was, fully extended. Sarah stood still, staring at it for a few long moments. Her heart began to race, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. Something didn't feel right. She was about to step forward when something else struck her. The house was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Sarah could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, but no sounds of the baby. She could have sworn she'd left Ethan in his crib, peacefully sleeping. She quickly turned to check the nursery, and to her relief, the baby was still in the crib, sleeping soundly. But the ladder was wrong. She didn't know why, but it was. It felt like an intrusion. Her instincts kicked in. Without a second thought, Sarah quietly stepped back, backing away from the ladder, trying not to make a sound. She was already starting to feel the weight of the unease creeping up her spine. The house was too quiet, and the ladder was still hanging there, as if it had been placed there deliberately. Without even thinking about it, she grabbed her phone from the counter, rushed back to the car, and drove a few blocks down the road. She didn't know why she was so unsettled, but something told her she needed to get help. She didn't even go back into the house. She called the police from the car. When the officers arrived, Sarah tried to explain as best as she could what she had seen. The ladder, the quiet house, the feeling of something being off. At first, the police thought it might have been a mistake. Maybe someone had come into the house while she was gone and left the ladder down without thinking. But the more they investigated, the more things didn't add up. The first thing they did was check the attic. It was empty. There was nothing up there that looked out of place. No sign of forced entry. No signs of anyone being up there recently. But then the officers started looking around the house more carefully, inspecting things like the light fixtures and the ceiling fans. That's when they found something strange. In the light fixture of the bathroom, there was a small, discreet camera, perfectly hidden. Another was embedded in the ceiling fan in their bedroom, and yet another was hidden behind a pinhole in the nursery wall. Each camera had a small, inconspicuous lens, barely visible to the naked eye. The police also found a short-range transmitter in the attic, connected to all the cameras. They quickly realized that the transmitter was sending a signal to a nearby location. Whoever had set up these cameras had been watching them for a long time, monitoring their every move inside their own home. The officers asked Sarah if she knew anyone who could have done this, but her mind went blank. She didn't recognize any of it. There was no sign of a break-in, no sign of forced entry. It was as if the person who had done this had access to the house at all times. And then it hit her. The key. Sarah remembered something she hadn't thought about in years. The house they lived in had been sold to them by the previous owners, a nice, older couple who had lived there for decades. They were friends with the neighbors, and they'd given a spare key to one of them. A neighbor a few houses down, a man named Greg, had been given a key for emergencies. Sarah had never really thought much of it, but now everything seemed to fit. Greg had been around for years, always friendly, always offering help when they needed it. But something felt off about him now. She couldn't explain why, but she felt like he had been hiding something from them. The police were already on their way to Greg's house when Sarah's phone rang. It was an officer who had just spoken with the neighbor. The officer's voice was calm but firm. "We've found the person who installed the cameras. It's your neighbor, Greg." Sarah felt her blood run cold. The officer explained that when they went to Greg's house, they found more equipment, more cameras, more transmitters. He had been monitoring the family for years, watching their every move, capturing their private moments. He had been using the key the previous owners had given him to come and go as he pleased. He knew their schedules, their habits, and he had been collecting footage of them without their knowledge. It turned out that Greg had been living a double life. On the surface, he was just a friendly neighbor who helped out with the occasional task. But behind closed doors, he had been hiding his obsession with Sarah and Dan. The cameras he had installed throughout their house had been transmitting everything. Every moment, every interaction, every little detail of their lives. But the most chilling part was yet to come. Sarah later found out that the day she had walked into the house and seen the ladder down was the day Greg had been in the process of upgrading his equipment. He had been in their attic, tweaking the system when she unknowingly walked in on him. He had been so focused on his task that he hadn't noticed her until she had already seen the ladder. He left in a hurry, probably realizing that she might figure out what he had been doing. That was the last time anyone in the neighborhood saw Greg. After that, he disappeared. The police believe he had been monitoring other families in the area as well, though they never found any evidence of it. In the weeks that followed, Dan and Sarah moved out of the house. They couldn't stay there anymore. The thought of someone watching them for so long, invading their privacy in such a personal way, was unbearable. They went to stay with relatives while they tried to figure out what to do next. As for Greg, he was never found. It was like he vanished into thin air, and despite an extensive search, no one knew where he went or what happened to him. Some people thought he had simply skipped town, but no one could say for sure. The police closed the case, but for Sarah and Dan, the trauma of what had happened stayed with them. They would never look at their home the same way again. The feeling of being watched, of having someone in the shadows, silently observing their every move, would never leave them. And even though they moved on with their lives, the thought of the attic ladder still haunted Sarah. She couldn't forget the day she walked in and saw it hanging down in front of her. It was a reminder that sometimes the things that seem the most normal, your own home, your own neighbors, can hide dark secrets. I used to live in this old house in Toronto with 2 other roommates, and we rented out the main floor. The house itself was a bit worn down, not exactly falling apart, but definitely showing signs of age. We shared the upstairs space with a stranger who lived in the basement. The guy in the basement was a mystery to us. We didn't know much about him, other than the fact that he was a big gamer and smoked a lot of weed. He mostly kept to himself, and we barely ever saw him. We'd hear him moving around downstairs, but it wasn't like he was ever really part of the house. He just lived there, did his thing, and that was that. But there was one thing that started to really get to me after a while: the coughing. Almost every night without fail, I would hear him coughing. It wasn't just the regular sound of someone clearing their throat or a mild cough here and there. No, this was something serious. It sounded like he was about to die, like he was struggling to breathe, choking on something. It was loud enough to make me worried, and I started hearing it more frequently. It was almost as if the guy was hacking his lungs out in a desperate attempt to catch his breath. I could hear it through the floor, the thick, phlegmy sound echoing up from beneath my room. At first, I thought it was just his way of dealing with the fact that he smoked all the time. I mean, people who smoke a lot sometimes get that awful smoker's cough, right? But there was something about the sound, the intensity of it, that bothered me. It wasn't like a typical smoker's cough. This sounded like something was wrong, like he was really struggling to get air. As time went on, I started noticing that the cough didn't seem to come directly from under my room. It was almost like it was coming from a different part of the basement, maybe further back under the house. There was something about the acoustics of the coughing that didn't line up with where I thought his room was. So one day, I mentioned it to my roommate, and we both decided to check it out. We went into the garage, which was above the part of the house that was over the strange coughing. The garage was old, just a basic space for storing junk, but we were curious now. My roommate and I jumped up and down on the floor, trying to pinpoint exactly where the coughing was coming from. Sure enough, we both heard it, the hollow sound of something beneath us. The noise echoed, and we could tell it wasn't coming from directly under the living room or the kitchen. It was coming from under the garage, which was a little strange. We didn't know what to think at that point. Maybe it was the ventilation system, or the way the house was built. Or maybe it was just some weird coincidence. But as the days went by, the coughing didn't stop. It was the same pattern every night, just as disturbing as before. At some point, I started wondering if something was really wrong with this guy. Was he sick? Had he collapsed in there, choking on something, and no one even knew? Then one day, the guy in the basement moved out. I don't know why he decided to leave, but he was gone, and that was when we got the chance to move one of our friends into the basement. We figured it would be cool, an upgrade from the old, cramped space we had. It would be our first time going down there to check out the area properly, and I was honestly excited. I had no idea what to expect from the basement. The weird coughing had piqued my curiosity, and now I was finally going to get a glimpse into the space below the house. We headed down there together, our friend taking the lead. It was a weird, musty place. Everything felt kind of damp and stale. The basement was dark and dingy, the kind of place where you could feel the years of neglect weighing on the air. We walked into the laundry room first, which was beneath my room. There we saw a little red door that looked out of place. It wasn't much to look at, a small, weathered door tucked into the corner. I had never noticed it before, but as soon as I saw it, I knew we had to open it. Our friend didn't understand why we were so fascinated with the door. He was pissed off, actually. He wasn't excited to be there. He was annoyed. He had just moved in, and the place was a mess. The walls were covered in stains, and the floor was sticky in spots. He muttered something about how the guy who lived there before had left without bothering to clean anything up. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in years, which seemed weird since the previous guy had only moved out recently. We opened the red door, and what we found made my stomach drop. It wasn't some cool secret room or hidden treasure. It was a small, cement room that looked like it hadn't been used in ages. There was trash everywhere, old furniture, broken boxes, and piles of things that looked like they had been forgotten and left to rot. The air in there was thick, musty, and full of mold. It felt like we were in a forgotten part of the house that no one was meant to see. The smell hit us immediately, and I gagged from the fumes. The place felt wrong, dangerous even, as if the air was poisoned from all the decay and rot in the room. I couldn't believe it. This was where the guy had been smoking weed every day. The room was practically a dungeon, and I couldn't imagine anyone willingly spending time in there. Our friend was still complaining, clearly not impressed with the state of the basement. He didn't even seem to care about the creepy red door or the moldy room we had found. He just kept talking about how messed up it was that the place hadn't been cleaned, but something he said made my blood run cold. He casually mentioned that the guy who had lived in the basement had actually been gone for 2 weeks before moving out. I didn't think much of it at first, but as soon as the words left his mouth, something clicked in my head. My thoughts raced, and I suddenly remembered the coughing. I had heard it for weeks after the guy moved out, still echoing through the house, still keeping me up at night. I thought about it for a moment, and a cold chill ran down my spine. The coughing had been happening even when the guy wasn't there. I could still hear it, like a distant, painful hack that sounded like it came from the creepy room under the garage. But that didn't make sense. The guy had been gone for 2 weeks. There was no way he was still down there, still making that sound. Yet I had heard it, every night, without fail. It echoed up through the floor. It had sounded just as real as before, just as intense and awful as the night he lived there. I couldn't shake the thought. What if he hadn't left? What if he was still down there, unable to leave, stuck in the room? The idea made me feel nauseous. Maybe he hadn't been the one coughing at all. Maybe someone, or something, else was still down there. I didn't want to entertain the thought, but I couldn't ignore it. The idea of hearing someone suffer like that, the sound of their last breaths echoing through the walls, it felt like a nightmare. We never really talked about it again, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd heard. The coughing continued, and I couldn't help but feel like there was something wrong, something sinister, about the room under the garage. To this day, I still don't know what was causing that noise. Was it the guy choking on his own breath? Was it something else, something that had stayed behind when he left? I still hear that coughing sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying awake in bed. It's always the same, hollow, raspy, desperate. It haunts me. When I was a kid, I lived in this small apartment with my mom. It wasn't anything fancy, just one of those old brick buildings with 3 floors, cracked concrete steps, and iron railings that were always cold to the touch. The kind of place where the walls were thin, and if you had the window open, you could hear everything on the street. Kids yelling, cars honking, people fighting, people laughing. Life packed tightly together. Our unit was on the 2nd floor. It was just me and my mom, like it had always been. My dad wasn't in the picture, and honestly, I never really missed him. Mom did her best. She worked long hours at a diner, and always came home smelling like coffee and bacon grease. But she was kind, always tried to talk to people, even if they didn't want to talk back. There was this woman who lived directly below us. I don't remember her name now, but I remember her face. Pale skin, dark hair, always pulled back tight. Thin lips, tired eyes. She lived alone. I'd see her sometimes when I was coming home from school or taking out the trash. She'd be on her little balcony, smoking a cigarette, staring at the parking lot like she was watching something important, but nothing ever really happened out there. She didn't smile much, but when she did, it looked like she hadn't used those muscles in years. My mom started talking to her one day, just out of the blue. She said something about how she looked lonely and invited her upstairs for coffee. At first, the woman didn't say anything, just nodded and gave this weak little shrug. But a few days later, she knocked on our door. I remember hearing it, a soft, hesitant knock, and when I opened it, she was standing there with a little tin of cookies. Store-bought ones, the kind that come in plastic wrap and taste like cardboard, but she said she thought it would be nice to bring something. From then on, she came over every few days. Sometimes with those same cookies, sometimes with nothing. They'd sit at the kitchen table and drink coffee or tea and talk. I'd be in my room doing homework or playing video games, but I could always hear them through the walls. My mom had this warm, soothing voice, and the neighbor, her voice was lower, more tired, and sometimes it cracked when she laughed, like she wasn't used to making that sound. They talked about life, about work, about stuff I didn't understand. Sometimes they sat in silence for long stretches, like just being near another person was enough. She started coming over more often, like almost every day. Mom said it was good for her, that she'd been through something rough with a breakup and didn't have any friends in the area. I never saw anyone else visit her. No family, no other friends. Just her and that little apartment below us. It was quiet down there, sometimes too quiet. Then all of a sudden, she stopped coming. At first, we thought maybe she was busy or just needed some time alone. A couple days passed, then a week. No knocking at the door, no footsteps on the stairs, no sound of her balcony door sliding open. Mom started to worry. She tried calling, but the phone rang and rang, never went to voicemail. We even walked by her window once when we were coming back from the store, and the blinds were all drawn. No lights on. The place looked empty, like no one had been there for days. After about 2 weeks, Mom said she couldn't stand it anymore. She wanted to go check on her. I remember feeling nervous about it, but I didn't say anything. I was maybe 10 or 11 at the time, old enough to know something felt wrong, but too young to argue with her. We walked down the stairs together. It was a Saturday, I think. The building was quiet, and the air felt still, like even the usual sounds were holding their breath. Mom knocked on the door, gently at first. No answer. She knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Then the door creaked open. Just like in those old movies where something bad always happens right after. It wasn't locked. It just eased open like it had been that way for a while, like maybe it hadn't been shut properly, or maybe someone left it like that on purpose. We stood there for a second, just staring inside. It was dark, the kind of dim where the shadows don't really move, and you can't tell what's in the corners. Mom stepped in first. I followed behind her, feeling like I shouldn't be there. The air hit me like a wall. It smelled wrong. Not just dirty or dusty. It smelled like something sweet that had gone rotten. Like fruit that sat out too long, mixed with something sharp and metallic. I didn't know what blood really smelled like at the time, but I'd never forget it after that. The place looked mostly normal at first. A few cups on the coffee table, dishes in the sink, a blanket on the couch. But something about it felt off. Like time had frozen, and everything was stuck in the moment she gave up caring. Mom called out her name once. Just once. Her voice echoed a little, but there was no reply. We moved further in. I remember my feet sticking slightly to the floor in one spot. I didn't want to look down. The bathroom door was open. The light was off, but there was enough daylight leaking in from the small window to see what was inside. She was in the bathtub. She was wearing a tank top and underwear. Her arms were over the sides, hanging limp, and the water was red, thick and dark, more like syrup than water. Her head was tilted back, and her mouth was open slightly. There was a razor blade on the edge of the tub. One of those old-fashioned ones, the kind barbers use. The tiles around the tub were splattered with dried streaks of brownish red. I don't remember what sound I made, but I must have made one because Mom suddenly stepped in front of me and told me to wait outside. I didn't listen right away. I couldn't move. My legs were locked in place. I just stared at her face. It didn't even look like she was in pain. It just looked empty, like she'd stopped being a person and was just there. Eventually, Mom pushed me gently toward the hallway and told me again to wait outside. I walked out of the apartment slowly, one step at a time, not even realizing my hands were shaking. The smell stuck to my nose. I felt like I was going to throw up. I sat on the stairs outside the apartment door, not knowing what to do. Mom came out a few minutes later. She had her phone in her hand and looked pale, but calm. She called the police. She didn't say much, just gave the address and said someone needed to come right away. Then she sat down next to me and didn't say anything for a long time. Eventually, she looked at me and said something I've never forgotten. "Don't worry, Mark. She was our friend. She won't haunt us." That was it. No comforting speech. No trying to shield me from what I'd seen. Just that. Like somehow that made it all better. The police came pretty quickly. They made us go back to our apartment while they checked everything out. Later, we found out more about what happened. She'd been dead for days before we found her. Nobody else had come looking. Nobody else cared enough to notice. The story was that her girlfriend had left her a few weeks before. They'd lived together for a while, but things got bad. Lots of fights, lots of crying. One day the girlfriend just packed up and left. She tried to hold it together after that, coming over to our place for tea, smiling even though it looked like it hurt her. But something cracked, and when it cracked, nobody was there to stop it. She left a note, but the police didn't let us see it. They told Mom a little about what it said. It was short. She wrote that she didn't want to feel pain anymore, that she didn't think anyone would miss her. It haunted me for a while, not in a ghost way like Mom said, but in my own head. I kept thinking about how quiet it had been in that apartment, how she just faded out and no one knew. No one checked, except us. And even then, it took us 2 weeks. Life went on after that. The apartment got cleaned out. A new tenant moved in a few months later. Someone younger, louder. Played music at night and slammed doors. I never forgot, though. Never forgot that smell, or that quiet, or the way the door had opened like it had been waiting for us. Mom didn't talk about it again. Not really. She still offered people coffee. Still tried to make friends. But something in her changed, too. She watched people more carefully. Asked more questions. Paid attention to the silences. And me? I stopped assuming people were okay just because they smiled. I learned that some people are drowning quietly, without making a sound. And that sometimes, being the only person who knocks on the door can mean more than you realize. We moved out a couple years later. Different building, different neighborhood. But every once in a while, I still think about her. Her face in the bathtub. That empty look. The smell. The silence. It sticks with you. It becomes part of you. Not in a spooky, horror story way. In a real way. In the kind of way that makes you double check on people. That makes you stop and ask if someone's okay. Even if they say they are. Because sometimes they're not. And sometimes they just need one person to care enough to notice. I was 7 years old when my parents sent me to live with my grandmother. They had to work in another city for a couple of months, waiting for my older brother to finish middle school. At first, I was ecstatic about the idea. My grandma's house was small, but to me it felt like a kingdom. I knew I would be spoiled. She had a soft spot for me, always had. My brothers and sisters had grown up, and now it was my turn to be the center of attention. My grandmother's house was a modest 2-bedroom place on a quiet street, tucked away in a corner of the neighborhood. The kind of place that seemed old but cozy. There was a big backyard, overgrown with weeds and wild flowers. The type of place where you could easily get lost for hours if you wandered far enough. My grandma didn't mind. She always had time for me, and my aunts, uncles, and cousins made sure I never got bored. But the house was a bit crowded. My grandma, as I said, lived with my aunts and uncle, and when I came to stay, that made for a full house. There were 4 of my aunts and my uncle, all living together in the small space. Most of my aunts were older, and they had their own quirks, but one of them, my Aunt Tina, was different. Aunt Tina had been schizophrenic for years. I was too young to understand the specifics of it, but I knew she wasn't like the others. She had a whole bedroom to herself, though no one really talked about why. The others, my aunts and I, shared the other bedroom, piled in together like sardines in a can, while Uncle Bob and Grandma slept in the living room. Looking back, I realize how odd it all was. But at the time, it didn't seem strange. It was just the way things were. I had my aunts around me, my uncle and grandma always close, and I didn't mind the cramped quarters. I was the youngest in the family, and in a way, I liked that everyone paid attention to me. My aunts would spoil me too, giving me extra candy or letting me stay up later than usual. They'd tell me stories, play games, or take me out on walks around the neighborhood. But then there was Aunt Tina. I didn't understand at first why she was always locked in her room. I thought it was just something she liked, a way of having her own space. She wasn't really the kind of aunt who played games with me or took me to the park. Instead, she spent most of her time in her room, talking to herself in strange, low whispers, or sometimes shouting things I couldn't quite understand. Her room looked different too. The walls were covered with strange drawings, bright, colorful, childish scribbles in crayon, some of them stretching across the entire wall like a chaotic mural. I remember one of the drawings was of a big, green monster with eyes that seemed to follow me no matter where I stood in the room. It was unsettling, but as a child, I didn't know any better. I just thought it was a little weird, but nothing more. It wasn't until later that I realized how serious Aunt Tina's condition was. The rest of the family did their best to care for her, but they didn't seem to have much control over the situation. Sometimes, when she'd get especially agitated, one of my aunts would try to give her medication, but Aunt Tina would always refuse. She hated the pills. My grandma, too, wasn't the best at getting Aunt Tina to take them. So, Aunt Tina spent most of her days alone in that room, locked away from the rest of the family, talking to herself, drawing on the walls, and sometimes just sitting there, staring blankly into space. One night, I woke up to something that would change everything. I don't remember exactly what time it was, but the house was quiet. My aunts and I were in the bedroom, tucked into our makeshift sleeping arrangements. The moonlight was pouring through the thin curtains, casting a soft, silver glow across the room. I was sleeping soundly, curled up on my side, when I felt something. It was a strange feeling, like someone was watching me, but more than that, I felt a presence, cold and unsettling. My eyes fluttered open, and there, standing in the doorway of our bedroom, was Aunt Tina. She was holding something in her hand, something shiny. At first, I thought it was a toy or something she had found. But then I realized it wasn't a toy. It was a pair of scissors, gleaming in the moonlight. My heart started to race, and I felt a chill creep down my spine. Aunt Tina didn't seem to notice me. She was just standing there, staring at me with an odd, vacant expression on her face. Her eyes were wide open, but they didn't look quite right. They were distant, unfocused. Her body was frozen, almost like a statue. I didn't know what to do. I just lay there, too scared to move, watching her. I felt a knot form in my stomach as she started walking toward me, her steps slow and deliberate. She didn't speak. She didn't make a sound. The only thing I could hear was the soft scrape of the scissors in her hand, tapping against her fingers. I don't know why she did it, but as she got closer, she stopped at the edge of my bed and slowly lowered the scissors toward me. My breath hitched in my throat, and I could feel the panic rising inside me. She wasn't saying anything, just staring at me with that same blank expression. And then I realized she was holding the scissors so close to my neck. The cold metal glinted in the dark, and I could feel the weight of the scissors, just inches from my skin. I wanted to scream. I wanted to jump up and run, but I was paralyzed with fear. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, but all I could think was that she was going to hurt me. That thought was all I could focus on as I lay there, frozen. Suddenly, I heard footsteps running toward the room. The door burst open, and my Aunt Lisa rushed in, pulling Aunt Tina away from me. There was a loud scuffle as Aunt Tina resisted, trying to get back to me. I could hear my aunts calling for Grandma, panic rising in their voices as they tried to restrain Aunt Tina. Grandma came rushing in, her face pale, her eyes wide with confusion. It was clear she hadn't known what was going on. Aunt Tina was eventually subdued, and someone called the police. I don't remember much of what happened next, but I do remember that Aunt Tina was taken away, and the rest of us were left in a state of shock. I couldn't understand what had happened. All I knew was that I felt scared, more scared than I had ever been in my life. That night, my parents were called. They arrived soon after, and my mom held me tightly, whispering reassurances in my ear. I didn't feel reassured at all. I felt like I had narrowly escaped something horrible. I was still shaking when my parents decided to take me home. It was clear to them that living with my aunt had become too dangerous, even if it wasn't something we had expected. They packed my things quickly. My mom and dad didn't say much, just that we were leaving. It felt like a dream, like I was being pulled out of a nightmare, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to wake up. When we drove away, I looked back at Grandma's house, but I didn't feel sad. I felt relieved, but also confused. I had been excited to live there, but now it felt like I had been living in a place I didn't understand. a place where danger could lurk behind a smile or behind a pair of scissors. But the strange events didn't end there. We moved to a new house, an old, crumbling building on the edge of town. It was big, but it wasn't the kind of place that felt welcoming. The old floors creaked under my feet, and the walls were damp and peeling. There was a strange smell in the air, a mix of mildew and something earthy, almost rotten. But the weirdest part wasn't the house itself. It was the fact that every night, earthworms would crawl up through the toilet and shower drain. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but the longer we stayed there, the worse it got. The worms would come up in small wriggling piles, crawling over the tiles, their slimy bodies glistening under the harsh bathroom light. My parents were just as unsettled as I was, but they didn't know what to do. The house was old, and the plumbing was a mess. They tried to fix the drains, but nothing helped. The worms kept coming. I never got used to it. Every time I went to the bathroom at night, I would be filled with dread, unsure if the worms would be waiting for me again. My childhood, which had once been full of excitement and adventure, was now clouded by a sense of unease that never quite left. But I survived. It's been years since that time, and now I look back on it as a series of strange and unsettling memories. I've come to terms with everything that happened at Grandma's house, and though I still don't understand it all, I've learned to let it go. As for Aunt Tina, I never saw her again after that night. I hope she found the help she needed, though I'll never know for sure. I don't talk about those days much, but I carry them with me. And every now and then, I still remember the feeling of those cold scissors so close to my neck, and the earthworms that seem to never stop coming. I think about how strange life can be, how quickly things can change, and how in a moment, everything you thought you knew can be turned upside down. It was just past midnight when I found myself standing alone at the train station. The platform was mostly empty, and the night air was cold, a little sharp, cutting through my jacket as I waited for my train. There were a few dim lights flickering along the edges of the platform, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch farther than they should. The whole place had a sort of stillness to it, the kind of quiet that feels almost oppressive, like something's waiting. I didn't like it much, but I couldn't avoid it either. I had missed the earlier train, and this one was the last of the night. I had no choice but to wait. It wasn't a typical station. It was smaller, quieter than most. The train schedules were a little irregular, especially late at night. I checked my phone again. I was the only person around, or at least I thought I was. The only sound was the occasional hum of a light overhead, or the distant sound of something shifting in the darkness. That was when I first saw him. He wasn't far off, walking down the platform toward me. At first, he just looked like any other late-night commuter, maybe someone who had missed their last train too, or just someone waiting for a ride. But then, I noticed something strange. He was carrying a suitcase. It was a large one, black and kind of bulky. At first, it didn't stand out much, just another bag, another traveler. But as he got closer, I saw that he was struggling with it. It wasn't the weight of the suitcase that caught my attention at first. It was the way he was moving, awkwardly, like he couldn't quite get a good grip on it. He kept adjusting his hands, shifting his body, as though trying to balance the weight of it, but it wasn't working. The suitcase seemed to be heavier than it should have been, much heavier than it looked. My first instinct was to offer to help, but I stopped myself. Something about his movements didn't feel right, like he wasn't just struggling with a heavy bag. There was something else, something that made my gut twist. As he drew closer, I started to get a better look at him. He was tall, maybe 6'5", and thin, but he had this odd, almost disturbing presence about him. His clothes were tattered. He wore a dark, dirty jacket, and his pants were stained with mud. The most unsettling thing, though, was his face. It was covered in dirt, up to his hairline, and there were these deep, jagged cuts along his forearms that looked like they hadn't been cleaned or treated. The cuts were fresh, too, bleeding lightly, leaving smudges of red on his skin. His eyes were bloodshot, and the way he moved, his head jerking slightly, his gaze darting, made me feel uneasy, like he wasn't fully aware of his surroundings. When he got within a few feet of me, he stopped. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there for a moment, holding the suitcase in front of him like it was a barrier between us. Then, without warning, he spoke, his voice rough, slurred, definitely not sober. "Take it," he muttered, his tone harsh, aggressive. He was staring at me now, like he was waiting for me to do something. I froze for a moment, unsure of what he meant. Take the suitcase? Why? Why was he asking me to take something from him? The whole situation felt wrong. I just stood there, caught off guard. My mind raced. Was this some kind of test? A prank? But nothing about it felt like a joke. The more I looked at him, the more I realized he was struggling. Not just with the suitcase, but with himself. His breath came in quick bursts, like he was out of breath, or maybe something else. The liquid leaking from the suitcase became more noticeable. It wasn't water, it was too thick, almost sticky, and it dripped from the seams of the suitcase, pooling on the ground at his feet. I didn't want to get any closer. I wasn't sure what was inside that suitcase, but something about it felt off. My heart started to race. My mouth went dry. "Take it," he repeated, more forcefully this time, his voice rising in anger. I took a step back instinctively, my mind screaming at me to get away, but I didn't know how. What was going on? Why wasn't anyone else here to witness this? My train was due soon, but this guy, this stranger, was making me feel trapped, like I couldn't leave without drawing his attention. His eyes didn't leave me, not for a second. They were wild, unfocused. I muttered a weak, "Sorry," and turned to walk away, my steps quickening. I kept my eyes forward, praying the train would arrive on time. But the guy didn't move. Instead, he started following me, dragging that heavy suitcase behind him, muttering under his breath in a language I didn't understand. It was like he was talking to himself or to someone else, but the words were incoherent, almost guttural. The closer he got, the more panicked I became. What was I supposed to do? Should I call for help? But who could I even call at this hour? My phone felt like a useless weight in my pocket. By the time I heard the familiar sound of my train pulling into the station, I was already halfway down the platform. I started walking faster, my legs moving without thought, toward the train doors. I could hear him behind me, still muttering, still dragging that suitcase, his steps quickening too. I didn't dare turn around. The train was slowing to a stop, and I could see the doors beginning to open. A sense of relief flooded me. But then, just as I was about to step into the train, I heard him again. His voice was louder now, his words sharper, more frantic. "Take it! You take it!" he shouted. But his words weren't just directed at me now. They felt like they were directed at anyone, at the world, at something only he could see. I couldn't make sense of it. I didn't hesitate. I stepped onto the train just as the doors closed behind me, shutting out the night, shutting out the man with the suitcase. I leaned against the cold window, my heart still hammering in my chest. The train jerked forward, pulling away from the station, and I watched as the guy stood there, staring at me through the glass. He was still pointing at me, still yelling. His words sounded like gibberish now, distorted, incomprehensible. He was pacing back and forth in front of the train, his hands raised in frustration, his body twitching with every movement. I could see his face pressed up against the window as the train slowly pulled away from the platform. His eyes were locked on mine, burning with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I couldn't look away. I don't know why, but I couldn't. The whole thing was so surreal. Suddenly, he punched the window with all his strength. The sound of his fist hitting the glass was like a crack of thunder, loud and jarring. I jumped back, startled, and for a moment, I thought the window might break. But it didn't. The glass held firm, and the train continued to move forward, the man growing smaller in the distance. He stood there, fists clenched, staring at me with those wild eyes, still muttering something under his breath. I couldn't hear him anymore, but I could see the way his mouth moved, the way his body trembled with frustration. It felt like he was trapped in his own world, and I was just a bystander to whatever nightmare he was living. The train ride felt like it took forever. The other commuters on board barely noticed the scene, some of them looking at me with puzzled expressions as I sat there, wide-eyed, trying to process what had just happened. No one said anything, no one seemed to care, but I could tell they were all aware of the tension in the air. I couldn't shake the image of that man, his wild eyes, his erratic behavior, and the strange suitcase leaking that thick liquid. When I finally arrived at my stop, I didn't stick around. I grabbed my things and left the station as quickly as I could. I didn't know what was in that suitcase, or why that man had been following me, or why he had acted the way he did. I didn't know if I was being paranoid, if it was all just a coincidence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I tried to tell myself it was over, that the train ride had ended, that I was safe. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, and every time I heard a noise in the dark, I thought of that suitcase and the strange, unsettling feeling that had crawled under my skin. I used to have the kind of nightmares that felt so real, they bled into the waking world. Every night, I'd fall asleep with a knot in my stomach, praying for rest, but knowing it wouldn't come. I wasn't just afraid of the usual things that a kid might be, like monsters under the bed or in the closet. My nightmares were far more vivid, more twisted, and they lingered, lingering long after I woke up. Sometimes they even bled into reality. I would wake up, heart racing, drenched in sweat, and my body felt heavy like I was still trapped in the dream. The nightmares themselves were usually strange. Endless chases through dark, winding hallways, faces without bodies staring at me from behind thick curtains of shadow, and grotesque figures lurking in corners. The worst of them, though, were the ones where I would wake up in my own bed, except it wasn't my bed at all. The walls would stretch, or the room would shift in ways that felt wrong. Something always lurked in the shadows, just outside of my line of sight, and no matter how many times I tried to look, it was never there when I turned my head. It got to the point where I barely slept. 4 hours was the most I'd ever get in one night, and even that was interrupted by my own screams. I think it was the sleep deprivation that made everything worse. It was like I could never fully escape the nightmares, because even when I was awake, there were moments where my vision would blur, or I'd catch a glimpse of something just out of the corner of my eye. A shape, a flicker of movement, a shadow that wasn't there when I looked directly. That kind of paranoia. It made everything feel unreal. I would stop, take a breath, and turn to look again, but whatever it was would vanish, like smoke blown on the wind. But then one night, I saw something that didn't vanish when I looked. I was walking through the hallway of my house, a quiet, ordinary night. I had just come back from the bathroom, my mind still foggy from lack of sleep. It was around 2 a.m., and the only sound in the house was the quiet hum of the fridge in the kitchen. I was halfway down the hall when I turned to glance toward the end of it. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another trick of the mind. A shadow, an illusion, a figment of my exhaustion. But this time, the shape didn't disappear when I turned my head. There, standing at the end of the hallway, was a tall, dark figure. It wasn't solid. It was like a wisp, smoky and formless, twisting in a way that felt unnatural. What made my stomach drop, though, were the eyes. They were bright, too bright, like they were glowing in the low light of the hallway. Yellow, solid, piercing yellow eyes that seemed to burn straight into me. I froze. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and my breath caught in my throat. I didn't move a muscle. It was like I was paralyzed, my entire body telling me to run, but I couldn't. I couldn't even blink. The figure didn't move, but it felt like it was watching me, waiting for me to do something. My vision was spinning, and the sense of dread was overwhelming. The kind of fear that gripped your chest and made it impossible to breathe. I felt it crawling over my skin like I was being suffocated. And then it was gone. I blinked, and the figure had vanished. I stood there for a few moments, my mind scrambling to make sense of what had just happened. I took a few slow steps forward, my eyes scanning the hallway, but there was nothing there. Nothing at all. No shadow. No shape. Just the usual quiet emptiness of the house at night. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog from my mind, and then slowly, I turned around and walked back to my room. I didn't sleep much that night. In fact, I don't think I slept at all. The yellow eyes haunted me in the dark. A few days later, I remember sitting at the kitchen table with my father. We were eating breakfast, the usual cereal and milk, the dull hum of the morning like any other. I don't remember what prompted the conversation, but he started talking about a meeting he had with the church. He was involved in some church group at the time, and it wasn't unusual for him to come back from one of those meetings with something strange to say. He looked at me over his coffee cup, a strange expression on his face, like he wasn't sure if he should bring it up. But he did. He started, "The pastor said something kind of strange at the meeting last night. They've been keeping an eye on you." I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. He didn't seem to notice my reaction. He just kept talking. "They said, well, that something with yellow eyes had been tormenting you. That's how they put it. Like it was following you." I stared at him. My throat went dry. The color drained from my face. I don't know how to describe the way it felt. It was like the floor fell out from under me, and I was suddenly spinning. I had never told him about the figure I'd seen in the hallway, the yellow eyes. There was no way he could have known. Yet, there he was, telling me about it like it was a normal conversation. My mind raced, and my heart hammered in my chest, trying to process what he was saying. I don't remember what I said to him. Maybe nothing. I think I just nodded and went back to picking at my cereal. But inside, I was terrified. How could he know? How did they know? It felt like something I couldn't escape, something far bigger than me, far outside of my understanding. That feeling, that dread, that sensation of being watched, it wasn't just in my head. The strange part was that it eventually stopped. The nightmares faded away, the shadows grew dimmer, and the feeling of being hunted slowly dissipated. Life went on. I grew up. I forgot about it mostly. The nightmares became a distant memory, tucked away somewhere in the back of my mind. I think I convinced myself that it was just the result of my overactive childhood imagination. But as I got older, I learned to dismiss it, to forget about it entirely. That is, until a few months ago. I had been talking with my sister. She was just starting to get into horror movies, and I took her to a midnight showing of one that had just come out. We laughed and joked around afterward, discussing the movie and talking about other weird and creepy experiences we'd had growing up. We tried to rationalize everything, you know? Looking back at things that had seemed so strange and scary at the time, we found ways to explain them. Most of it made sense. Flickering lights, sounds in the night, shadows cast by trees in the wind. All easily explainable. But then she told me something that made my blood run cold. She had seen shadow people, just like I had. I laughed at first. I thought it was funny, really. But then she told me about one experience that made my laughter die in my throat. She had been homesick from school one day, staying alone at the house. It was a bright, sunny afternoon, and she was watching TV in the living room. Then she heard something. At first, she thought it was just the house settling, but then it got louder, closer. She turned her head toward the hallway, and that's when she saw it. A tall, wispy figure, standing at the end of the hallway. The same shape I had seen years ago. The same silhouette, and the same yellow eyes. They were glowing in the daylight. My blood ran cold. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and the room seemed to grow smaller. I didn't know what to say. It was like I had been transported back in time, back to that same feeling of dread that had plagued me for so many years. And then she told me more. She told me that she had frozen in place, like I had. She couldn't move, couldn't look away. She just watched it, and then it was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the yellow eyes. Were they real? Had we both imagined it? Why did it seem to follow us both? I couldn't answer those questions, but one thing was for sure. I had never felt that same level of dread before. And maybe, just maybe, it had never really gone away. It was one of those lazy, warm afternoons that felt like they could stretch on forever. The kind of day where time seemed to move slower, the sun sitting just low enough in the sky to cast long shadows, and the air was thick with that dry summer heat. I must have been around 9 or 10 back then, and most days were spent running around outside until the streetlights came on or someone's mom yelled for dinner. I lived in a quiet area, not completely out in the country, but not really in town either. Just rows of old ranch-style houses spread out along a two-lane road, surrounded by woods and long stretches of grass and farmland. There were no sidewalks, just gravel shoulders, ditches, and fence posts, and you could hear cars coming a long way before you ever saw them. That afternoon, I was at my friend's house, 2 houses down from where the paved road curved into a wider stretch of gravel. There were 3 of us, me, my friend Marcus, and his cousin Trevor, who was staying over for the week. We were in the front yard, digging through an old plastic tub of Nerf guns and busted water pistols, trying to piece together some kind of game. The grass in Marcus' front yard had gone yellow from the heat, and there was a broken lawn chair tipped over near the porch. Every so often, a cicada buzzed loudly from one of the trees nearby, and the occasional breeze brought in the smell of cut grass and hot pavement. We'd been out there for maybe 20 or 30 minutes, laughing, chasing each other around, when I noticed a truck come down the road. It was an older model, dull red, with peeling paint and rust blooming around the wheel wells. I didn't think much of it at first. Trucks weren't uncommon out here. Everybody had one, mostly beat-up ones used for hauling stuff around. But this guy slowed way down as he passed the house, which caught my eye. He was creeping along like he was looking for something. I figured maybe he was lost or trying to read a mailbox. The truck rolled past, then kept going until it disappeared around the bend at the end of the road. A few minutes later, it came back. This time, I noticed he didn't just slow down. He practically stopped in front of the house. I glanced over at Marcus, who was crouched behind a bush pretending it was cover, but I didn't say anything yet. I just kept watching as the truck crawled by again, tires crunching softly over the gravel. Then it circled back. Again. The third time, I saw something in the man's hand. It was small, square-shaped. He was holding it up in front of him, pointing it at us through the open driver's side window. At first, I thought maybe it was a phone. But this was a while ago, before everyone had smartphones, and as I looked closer, I realized it was one of those old handheld camcorders. The kind you'd see dads using at school recitals or baseball games, with the little flip-out screen on the side. It was obvious now, he was recording us. That's when I started to feel that prickling sensation in my chest, like something wasn't right. I looked back at Marcus and Trevor. They were both looking at the truck now too. None of us said a word. We just stood there, frozen, as it passed again, the driver pointing that camera right at us. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just stared, filming. When the truck finally passed and kept going down the road, we didn't wait. We dropped everything and bolted inside Marcus' house, slamming the screen door behind us. I remember my heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything over it. My mouth was dry, and I kept glancing out the front window, expecting to see that red truck sitting there in the road. Marcus' mom was in the kitchen. When she saw us, all out of breath and panicked, she asked what was going on. We told her what we saw, and after hearing it, she told Marcus and Trevor they had to stay inside. Then she looked at me and said I should head home. I stared at her for a second, confused. I explained my mom wasn't home. She was still at work and wouldn't be back for another hour or two. I didn't feel safe walking back alone, not after what we'd just seen. But she didn't seem to really hear me. She just repeated that I needed to go home, like that settled it. She wasn't unkind about it, just distracted, like maybe she didn't want to deal with having another kid in the house. I don't know. Maybe she didn't think it was as serious as we did. Maybe she just didn't want to get involved. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just nodded, walked out the front door, and shut it behind me. The moment I stepped back outside, the heat hit me again, heavy and still. I stood there for a second, looking both ways down the road. The truck wasn't in sight. Everything looked the same as it always did. Quiet, calm, normal. But it didn't feel normal. Not anymore. I started walking fast, arms pumping a little harder than usual, trying to convince myself I was fine. I was just going home, after all. I'd walked this road hundreds of times. I knew every mailbox, every fence post, every driveway and dead squirrel flattened into the road. I kept telling myself he was gone. Just some weirdo. Probably didn't mean anything. Probably just bored. But I couldn't stop thinking about the way he held that camera. The way he drove by again and again, slower each time. He wasn't just lost. He wasn't just curious. I picked up my pace. The gravel crunched louder beneath my sneakers. My backpack bounced against my back. I started to sweat, not just from the heat, but from that awful feeling that something wasn't right. I felt exposed, like there were eyes on me. I couldn't shake it. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that red truck creeping up behind me. About a quarter mile down the road, there was a wide turn where the trees got thick. A stretch of woods ran along that part, and the shade made it cooler, darker. I hated that part, even before all this. It always felt like something could be hiding just beyond the tree line. I started jogging. That's when I heard it. A soft growl of tires over gravel. Behind me. I didn't even look. I just ran. Full sprint. Legs pumping, heart slamming in my chest like it was trying to get out. I didn't care if I tripped. I didn't care if my backpack bounced so hard it bruised my spine. I just ran. The sound of the engine grew louder. I heard it behind me, and I pictured that truck, that camera, that man's face. I imagined him pulling up beside me, reaching out to grab me, yanking me into that truck. My vision blurred with panic. My lungs were burning, but I didn't stop. I don't know how long I ran like that. A minute? 2. It felt like forever. Finally, I reached my driveway. I tore up the dirt path, stumbling on the edge of a pothole, and slammed open the front door. The house was silent and empty. My mom's car wasn't there. Of course it wasn't. I collapsed onto the carpet, chest heaving, hands shaking. I crawled over to the window and peeked out through the blinds. There was nothing out there. No truck. No sound. Just heat waves shimmering over the road and the faint buzz of insects. I stayed there, crouched low beneath the window, for what felt like half an hour. Every time I thought I heard something outside, A car, a bird, anything. I'd freeze, heart pounding all over again. Eventually, my mom came home. I ran straight to her, told her everything, every detail. Her face went pale as I talked, and by the time I was done, she was furious. Not just at the man in the truck, but at Marcus' mom for making me leave. She couldn't believe another adult would hear that story and still send me off alone. She wanted to go back down there and yell at her, but I begged her not to. I just wanted to stay home. I didn't want to talk about it anymore. I didn't want anyone to think I was being dramatic. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every time a car passed outside, I jumped. I couldn't get the sound of that engine out of my head. I couldn't stop picturing the camera, pointed right at us. I kept thinking about what could have happened if I'd been just a little slower, if the truck had caught up to me. The next day, my mom called the police. She reported everything I'd seen, gave a description of the truck and the man. I don't know if they ever found him. I never heard any updates, and I didn't ask. But for weeks after that, every time I saw an old red truck, I froze. Even years later, I still get that weird feeling whenever I see someone driving too slowly in a neighborhood, especially if they're alone. I didn't go back to Marcus' house much after that. Not because I was mad at him or anything, but something about that place felt different to me now. It wasn't a safe place anymore. It felt like the one time I really needed an adult to protect me. No one did. And that kind of thing sticks with you. Over time, life went on. I got older. I walked that road again, hundreds more times. But I never forgot that feeling, that run, that fear. Now looking back, I realized just how lucky I was. There are so many stories that don't end like mine did. So many kids who don't make it home, who get into trucks with people who smile and say all the right things. That man didn't get out of his truck, didn't chase me down, but the fact that he was there at all, filming kids on a quiet street, is more than enough. I think about it sometimes, when I see kids playing in a front yard, carefree and loud, the way we were. I always look twice when I see a car go by slowly. I never assume it's nothing, because that day taught me something real, something I'll never forget. You're not always safe, even when it feels like you should be. And sometimes the only thing between you and something terrible is your own two legs and the fear that makes them run. I had been living out of my car for a few months by the time I found this spot. It wasn't anything fancy. I'd park on logging roads, side streets, places where no one would bother me. The isolation was both a blessing and a curse. I could be left alone, but every now and then, the silence would get to me, especially at night when it felt like the entire world was empty. It was just me and the trees and the road, stretching into nowhere. The first time I parked in that one spot, it felt good. I had driven for hours that day, just trying to clear my head. I found a little pull-off on the edge of a dirt logging road that seemed perfect. There weren't any houses around, just thick forest and the occasional sound of wildlife. I was close enough to town that it wasn't a hassle to get there when I needed something, but far enough that no one would come around. It was peaceful. At least, that's what I thought at the time. That first night, I wasn't really asleep. My body was tired, but my mind wouldn't shut off. I'd been on the road too long, bouncing from one temporary stop to another. I think it was around 3 in the morning when I first felt it. A feeling of being watched, like someone was just outside the car, close enough that I could almost hear them breathing. I brushed it off. It was just paranoia. I had heard stories of people on the road who went a little crazy from too much solitude. My mind had to be playing tricks on me. I tried to go back to sleep, but the feeling wouldn't go away. And then it happened. I wasn't fully awake, but I wasn't asleep either. It was this in-between state where my mind was half in the dream world, half in the real one. I had a waking dream, or maybe it was a hallucination, I don't know, but I could swear I saw a shadow move past my window. It was slow and deliberate, like it knew I was there, and it was taking its time. I could feel my heart racing in my chest. I wanted to reach for my phone, but I was frozen in place. The silhouette moved to the back of the car, and for a second, I thought it was just a trick of the light, or maybe an animal. But no, it wasn't. It didn't make any sound like an animal would. It was too deliberate. I stayed still for what felt like hours. I don't know how much time passed, but I didn't move until the shadow finally disappeared into the trees. When it was over, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. My mind was racing, and my body was too tense. I don't know if it was real or not, but it sure felt real. The next day, I didn't think much about it. I convinced myself it was just my imagination. After all, I had been on the road a lot, and I wasn't getting enough sleep. It was easy to let the mind play tricks. So I moved on. I found other places to park, just to mix things up. A few nights here, a few nights there. I kept away from that spot for a while, figuring I just had a bad night. But the dreams kept coming back. Every time I went back there, it was the same thing. This deep, unsettled feeling like someone was watching me. I'd lie awake in the car, staring at the ceiling, straining to hear anything. Every rustling sound, every creak of the trees, felt like it was someone out there waiting. I couldn't shake it. The dreams were worse too. Images of someone standing just outside the car, trying to get in, trying to pull at the door handles. It felt like I was being hunted. The worst part was the nights when I woke up and heard things outside. The sound of branches cracking, footsteps, the softest scrape against the side of the car. I would lie perfectly still, holding my breath, wondering if I was imagining it. But I couldn't ignore the fear that tightened in my chest. It wasn't the fear of something I couldn't see. It was the fear of something close. Something just outside my window waiting. I'd listen for a long time, sometimes hearing nothing, sometimes hearing a faint rustle that would send my heart into overdrive. I told myself I was being irrational. There were no other cars around, no people. It was just the forest, the trees, nature. Still, I started avoiding that place for a while. I found other places to park, new spots off different roads. But something about that place kept calling me back. Maybe I was just looking for comfort and familiarity, or maybe it was just the closest place to the town I'd been coming from. One afternoon, I'd been driving all day, and I was exhausted. I just wanted to pull over and sleep for a while. My body was so tired that I couldn't fight it anymore. So, I went back to that same spot. I parked the car, reclined the seat, and tried to settle in. I figured a nap would do me good, and maybe I'd feel a little less on edge when I woke up. I closed my eyes, and for a while it was peaceful. Then, just like before, I heard it. This time it wasn't the rustling of branches. It was the sound of a bicycle. The soft whirring of the wheels as they spun along the dirt road. I opened my eyes, confused. I hadn't heard a car pass by, and there was no one else around, not that I knew of. I glanced out the window and saw a man walking his bicycle down the road, heading right past my car. He was dressed in ragged clothes, and his face was unshaven, but it wasn't his appearance that unsettled me. It was the way he moved. He was walking slowly, methodically, like he knew I was watching. Like he wasn't surprised at all to find me there. I didn't recognize him at first, but then it clicked. This was the guy who had been around town, rummaging through trash cans, picking up bottles and cans. People called him a bottle picker, but I never knew his name. I'd seen him before, usually near the dumpsters behind stores or along the road, never really interacting with anyone. He always kept to himself, but he was a fixture in the area. And now he was right here, near my car, walking past it like it was completely normal for him to be out in the middle of nowhere, on a logging road, with no one else around. It was unnerving. I watched him as he walked past, and for a second, I wondered if he knew I was in the car. If he could hear me breathing, if he could see the shadow of me lying there. The tension in my chest grew tighter. I wasn't sure why, but the whole situation made my skin crawl. I could feel my heart beating in my throat, the way it always did when something didn't sit right. He didn't look at me. He didn't stop. He just kept walking down the road, his bicycle beside him. And as he moved further into the trees, I felt the weight of the silence settle in again. The moment he was gone, I exhaled in a rush, realizing that I had been holding my breath. I didn't go back to sleep. I couldn't. My mind raced with thoughts of the man, what he was doing out there, why he was so calm. I didn't want to stay in that spot any longer. I pulled out and drove off, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my bones. For the next few days, I stayed in different places. I moved farther away from town, finding spots that felt safer, even though I knew it was probably just the fear talking. But I couldn't shake the image of that man, walking his bicycle through the woods, as if he belonged there. I never went back to that spot again. I couldn't. Something about it had shifted. It wasn't just the weird dreams or the feeling of being watched. It was that man. The way he seemed too comfortable out there, in the middle of nowhere, like he was part of the woods, part of something I didn't understand. I ended up finding a different place to stay. I moved into a small apartment I could barely afford, but it felt like a step up from living in my car. I still thought about that place, and about the man who had wandered through. I couldn't help but wonder if there was more to that spot than I had realized. If maybe I had disturbed something by coming back. But whatever it was, I wasn't going to stick around to find out. The road, the logging trails, the quiet, it was all too much sometimes. And sometimes, even now, I still think about that night. It was early spring when my wife and I decided to take a short trip to Bath. We'd both been swamped with work for months, and the idea of escaping for a few days to a quiet little place sounded perfect. I booked a small rental cottage on the edge of town, tucked away from the busier streets, but still close enough to walk into the city center. It looked cozy in the photos: stone walls, a short wooden gate at the front, and a garden path made of gravel. The listing mentioned it was once a gardener's cottage in the 1800s, now refurbished for modern comfort. It seemed perfect, just remote enough to feel peaceful, but not completely isolated. We arrived in the afternoon after a long drive. It was cloudy but not cold. The sky had that early spring grayness to it, with hints of new green in the hedges and damp earth underfoot. The cottage itself was small, just a sitting room, kitchen, bedroom, and bathroom, all on one level. The bedroom faced the front of the property, with its only window overlooking the tiny garden and the wooden gate. I remember thinking it was charming in a quiet, simple way. You could hear birds and the occasional passing car from a road just out of sight, but mostly it was still, peaceful. That first day was uneventful. We walked into town, had dinner at a pub, came back just after dark. There was a motion-activated light above the front door that flicked on when we came through the gate. I remember noticing how bright it was, casting harsh shadows across the stone wall. The kind of light that made you feel exposed. We locked the front door, closed the curtains, and went to bed not long after. I'm a light sleeper, always have been. Every little creak and thud wakes me. I've tried earplugs, white noise, even medication once. None of it helps for long. That night, I lay awake for a while listening to the wind brushing against the window and the occasional gust rustling the hedges. My wife was out cold beside me, breathing slow and deep. The house made the normal settling sounds, with creaking, the occasional pop from the old radiator. It all felt normal. I finally started to drift off sometime after midnight. I don't know what woke me exactly, but I was suddenly wide awake. Not just stirred, but alert. That deep, animal part of the brain snapping into focus. Something had changed. It was silent in the room, too silent. I listened, holding my breath, trying to make sense of what had jolted me. Then I heard it. The wooden gate creaked open. Not fast. Not the kind of swing you'd hear if the wind had caught it. It was slow, controlled, deliberate. The kind of movement that only comes when someone is trying to be quiet. Then the click of the latch resting back into place. I sat up in bed instantly, heart pounding. The window was right beside the bed, and even through the closed curtains I could sense movement on the other side. I strained to hear. After a few seconds, I picked up the soft crunch of feet on gravel. Light steps, careful, trying not to be heard. I knew what our walkway sounded like underfoot. It was impossible to walk on it without making noise. Even in bare feet or socks, the stones would shift and grind. I slid out of bed slowly, trying not to wake my wife. I didn't want her to panic unless she had to. I crossed the bedroom in 3 long steps and reached for the curtain. Just as my hand touched the fabric, the motion light outside flicked on. Instant brightness. A tall shadow jerked across the wall just outside the window. The shape was distorted but unmistakable. A person, just one moving fast, but then freezing still when the light hit them. My chest tightened. There was no reason, none, for anyone to be inside our gate at that time. No deliveries, no neighbors, no friends in town. We hadn't even told anyone where we were staying, and they were trying to sneak in. That was enough for me. I moved fast. Not stumbling, not unsure. Just instinct. Straight to the kitchen, which was only a few feet from the front door. I didn't even turn on the lights. My hand went to the knife block on the counter. I pulled the biggest one I could find, a long stainless steel chef's knife, and held it tight, point angled slightly down. I stood to the side of the front door, out of direct line of sight, waiting. The light outside stayed on for about 30 seconds. In that time, I heard nothing. Not a footstep. Not a breath. The kind of silence that isn't natural. It stretched long enough that I started to question whether I'd imagined it. But I knew I hadn't. The gate, the gravel, the shadow. It was all real. Then I heard it. A rush of steps, fast, crunching gravel, not careful anymore. Running. The sound of the gate slamming shut. Not gently this time. Hard. Loud. Final. I stood frozen for a few seconds longer, knife still gripped in my hand, staring at the door. Then I moved to the side window, peeking out through the edge of the curtain, just in time to see the shadow of a figure disappear down the road. The light above the door clicked off, and the world outside returned to darkness. My wife had woken by then. She hadn't seen anything, but she'd heard the footsteps. She told me later she'd watched from the bed as the light outside flared and then died, and just after it did, the running started. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. I checked the lock on the door 3 times. I pushed the wooden dining chair up against the knob for extra measure. We kept the kitchen light on and sat in the living room until dawn, my knife still resting on the coffee table. We never heard anything else that night. No more footsteps, no more gate, but the silence didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt heavy, like something had almost happened and barely missed us. The next morning, I stepped outside as soon as the sun came up. The garden looked the same. The gravel path showed a few new scuffs, nothing dramatic, just slightly disturbed spots near the door where someone had tried to walk quietly. The gate latch was loose, not broken, but it didn't click as tightly as it should have. I could see how it could be opened easily from the outside with a little effort. There were no cameras on the property, and the owner lived in another town. I sent them a message later that day to let them know what had happened. They were apologetic and offered to refund a night's stay if we wanted to leave early, but they didn't seem overly surprised. I asked if anything like that had happened before. They said no, but their response felt rehearsed, like they didn't want to scare off future guests. Maybe they were telling the truth. Maybe not. We stayed one more night, mostly because we didn't have another place to go on short notice, and leaving in the middle of the day with nowhere to land felt worse somehow. But we didn't sleep. Not really. Every small sound outside made me tense. I left a lamp on in every room. The knife stayed close. We left early the next morning, well before checkout time. I didn't look back at the gate as I loaded our bags into the car. I didn't want to see it. To this day, I have no idea what that person was doing. Maybe it was a burglar. Maybe just some idiot out late. But they didn't knock. They didn't call out. They opened a locked gate in the middle of the night, tried to sneak across a gravel path, and froze when they realized they were about to be seen. That's not normal behavior. That's not someone making a mistake. If the motion light hadn't come on, I might have opened that door face to face with them. Or worse, they might have tried the handle. They might have come in, and I would have been standing there with a knife, shaking and ready to use it. I think about that sometimes. What if I had opened the door, thinking I could scare them off, and they'd lunged at me? What if I had swung that knife first, assuming the worst, and it had turned out to be someone unarmed? What if it had been a teenager, or someone drunk and confused? I don't know. I don't think so. But I don't know. What I do know is that it wasn't nothing. It wasn't innocent. That person came onto the property on purpose, at night, without a word, and left only when they knew they'd been spotted. I've never stayed in a cottage like that again. Not one with a gate, right outside the window. Not one that remote. I double-check every door before I go to bed. I keep something heavy by my nightstand now, always within reach. It changed something in me that night. Even now, when I think about it, really sit and remember the sound of that gate creaking open, the soft steps on gravel, the sudden flash of light, and the darting shadow. It sends a chill right through me. Not because of what did happen, but because of what almost did. What nearly happened, right on the other side of that door. It still gives me goosebumps. I don't know if I've ever truly felt fear like that before. I consider myself a practical person, the type who likes to look at things logically. Skeptical of the strange, unwilling to believe in things that can't be explained. But there's something about that place, that hotel in the New Forest, that I can't shake. Even years later, just thinking about it sends a chill down my spine. I remember every detail as if it happened yesterday, the way the air felt in that room, the smell of old wood and dust, the sounds that echoed through the night. It was all so wrong, and I'm still not sure why. I was part of a large group, a kind of retreat or getaway, and we were staying at a hotel that had been converted from an old hunting lodge. It was big, imposing even, and had an aura of history hanging over it. the kind of place where the floors creaked and the walls seemed to whisper secrets. The hotel was set in the heart of the New Forest, a vast national park on the south coast of England. It was peaceful, with trees stretching for miles, but there was something about the place that didn't sit right with me from the moment we arrived. It wasn't just the hotel, it was the whole atmosphere, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. When I first stepped into the lobby, the air felt thick, heavy, as if something was waiting just out of sight. But I tried to brush it off. I was with friends, and the idea of an old, historical building wasn't exactly foreign to me. I'd stayed in old inns and ghost houses before, but this place felt different. There was a weight in the air, an oppressive feeling that pressed in on me from all sides. Still, I shrugged it off, told myself I was being silly, and went about my day. The room I was assigned was on the second floor, at the end of a long corridor. It was a spacious room, with tall windows that overlooked the dark expanse of the forest. The furnishings were old-fashioned, a mix of worn velvet chairs, heavy wooden furniture, and faded rugs. There was a large four-poster bed draped in thick curtains, and the walls were lined with dark oak paneling. But what struck me the most was the feeling of isolation in the room. Despite the hotel being full, it felt like I was the only one there, as if the walls were too thick to allow anyone else in. The first night was when it really started. I don't know what it was, but I just couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I tried to settle in, unpack my things, but every time I looked around, it was like the room was too quiet, too still. I started to feel like there were eyes on me, though I knew I was alone. I can't explain it, there's no logical reason for it, but it felt as though the room itself was watching me, like something unseen was waiting for me to make a sound or move. My skin crawled, and I couldn't stop the hairs on the back of my neck from standing up. When it came time to sleep, I couldn't bring myself to turn off the lights. That had never happened to me before. I've always been someone who could sleep in the dark without issue, but that night, I just couldn't do it. I left the bedside lamp on and buried myself under the thick covers, hoping the light would make me feel safe. But it didn't. The longer I lay there, the more uncomfortable I felt. It wasn't just the room. It was something else, something in the air, something that made me feel like I wasn't alone. I eventually fell asleep, though it wasn't a peaceful sleep. The dreams I had were vivid, so real that they felt like memories instead of dreams. I found myself in a trench, somewhere in France during the Great War. The air was thick with the smell of mud and smoke, and the constant thud of explosions rattled the ground beneath my feet. I could hear the distant boom of artillery pieces firing, the screams of men, the sound of boots slapping against the wet earth. It felt like I was there, really there, and I couldn't escape it. The noise was deafening, the pressure of it all crushing. I could taste the dirt in my mouth, feel the coldness of the trench walls pressing in on me. It was a nightmare, but it felt more like a memory, as though I had experienced it before. When I woke up, I was drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. I had never felt so disturbed, so out of sorts. I sat up in bed, breathing heavily, trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the room. It was dark, too dark, and the silence was overwhelming. But then I heard something, a noise from outside the window. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it became louder. A banging noise, like something metal being struck. I assumed it must have been a loose piece of roofing, something that hadn't been properly fastened, moving in the wind. But it didn't matter. The sound made my heart race even faster. It felt like a warning, like something was about to happen. I couldn't go back to sleep after that. The rest of the night was a blur. I don't remember much of it, just the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was like I was being watched, but every time I turned around, there was nothing there. I could hear faint footsteps in the hall outside, and sometimes it felt like someone was standing just beyond the door, waiting for me to open it. I don't know how long I lay there, in a kind of dazed panic, but I couldn't bring myself to leave the room. I felt trapped, unable to escape whatever presence lingered in the air. In the morning, I went downstairs for breakfast, trying to shake off the night before. But when I walked into the dining room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the wall, there was a frame containing several old photographs, along with a story about the history of the hotel. The hotel, it turned out, had been converted into a military hospital during World War I. The realization hit me like a slap in the face. The nightmares, the banging noises, the feeling of being in a trench, it all made sense now. But it wasn't just the history of the building that unsettled me. It was the fact that I hadn't known any of this before. I hadn't read anything about it, hadn't seen anything on television or in the news. I hadn't been thinking about the war, and yet I had dreamed about it so vividly, so completely. It was as though the hotel had somehow pulled those memories from my mind and made them real. I didn't say anything to the others at breakfast, though I could tell by the looks on their faces that they were feeling the same thing. Several people in our group mentioned feeling uncomfortable in their rooms, as though something was watching them, or like they were being followed. It was a shared experience, though none of us could explain it. I don't know why, but after that morning, I couldn't bring myself to stay in that room any longer. I went to a friend and asked if I could stay with them for the rest of the trip. They were glad to have me, as they'd been feeling the same unsettling presence. The oppressive feeling in the hotel never went away. It lingered, thick and suffocating, even in the daylight. No matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the sense of something wrong never lifted. My friend and I would try to laugh it off, talking about anything to distract ourselves from the eerie quiet of the hallways. But the moment night fell, the fear crept back in. We would huddle together in the room, both of us unable to sleep, too aware of the silence around us. By the end of the trip, I was glad to leave. When we checked out, the manager gave us a polite, if somewhat distant smile, as though she knew exactly what we had felt, but wasn't about to say anything. I don't know if she had ever experienced anything strange herself, but I got the impression that she was used to people not asking too many questions about the place. The hotel was old, its history long buried under layers of dust and time, and yet something about it seemed to reach through that time, pulling at the threads of memories that had no business being there. I've never been back to the New Forest, and I'm not sure I ever will. That experience stays with me, lodged in my memory like a splinter that I can't quite remove. I still don't know what happened there, and maybe I never will. But what I do know is this: sometimes history doesn't stay buried. Sometimes it rises up, and it makes you remember things that you'd rather forget. A couple of years ago, I was seeing this girl. You know how it is when you're in the early stages of a relationship, when the nights feel too short and you never really want them to end. We'd spend hours watching Netflix and chilling, just hanging out and enjoying each other's company. Most nights, I'd end up dropping her home late, around 1 or 2 a.m. It wasn't uncommon for us to sit in the car for a while after I'd pulled up outside her place. There was no rush, no one to answer to, no one waiting for us. The world outside the car felt distant, like it could wait. It was just us and the warmth of the car. This was back in early 2013, right in the middle of winter. The UK winters were as brutal as ever, cold, wet, and dark by 4 p.m. It wasn't unusual for the temperature to dip well below freezing during the night, and those cold nights made it feel like it took forever for the warmth to leave your bones. The thing is, we always kept the car running. The heater was our best friend, blasting warm air into the cabin as we sat in the car. It wasn't about the drive, the roads, or even the car itself. It was about not wanting to leave. I think we both knew we weren't ready to say goodbye just yet. The car I was driving at the time was my old EK Civic. If you're into cars, you probably know the model, though mine wasn't exactly in perfect condition. It had been through a lot. The suspension was slammed on coilovers, the wheels were rotas, and the exhaust. Well, that was a different story. The original exhaust was barely hanging on. The center silencer had a hole in it, which meant it leaked badly, especially after hitting speed bumps or driving over uneven camber in the road. I'd even removed the rear silencer completely because I thought it sounded cool. You know, that deep, throaty rumble from the exhaust was like music to my ears. At least I thought so, even if it was annoying to anyone else who heard it. I don't even know how many times we'd end up staying in that car until the early hours, but it happened often. We'd talk about anything and everything. Sometimes it would feel like the world outside was miles away, and we were just in our own little bubble. But as the minutes passed, we'd both start to drift, the warmth of the car and the softness of the night wrapping around us like a blanket. I can't even count how many times we'd end up dozing off in the car, me at the wheel, her beside me. I'd wake up in a daze to the sound of the car engine humming, the heater still blasting, and the headlights lighting up the empty street outside her house. It was always around 2 a.m. when I'd stir awake, bleary-eyed and disoriented. There were nights where I'd wake up, and the interior of the car was thick with the smell of exhaust fumes. That hole in the center silencer, the rusted arches, and the way the exhaust would release those fumes when the engine ran for so long, it wasn't great. I'd always think about rolling down the windows, but honestly, it was so cold outside that I just couldn't be bothered. We'd talk about it sometimes, laughing about how my Civic wasn't the most practical or the safest car. I'd joke that we were probably inhaling fumes and would end up with carbon monoxide poisoning at some point. We'd laugh it off, but then I'd just go back to staring at her or looking out the window, letting the sound of the engine lull me back to sleep. It was easier than thinking about what could actually be happening. I guess the thing I didn't think about, until much later, was how close we were to danger. The car wasn't exactly safe in that state. I mean, I knew the exhaust needed fixing, but it wasn't something that was high on my priority list. That Civic was old, a bit of a junker, but it had character. And to be honest, I was too caught up in the moment, in the late-night conversations, in the warmth of her presence, to really care about the details. The engine running, the fumes leaking through the holes in the exhaust system, the rust eating away at the body. I didn't think about any of that. We were just two people who didn't want the night to end. There were times when I woke up in the car, not realizing how long we'd been there. I'd check the clock on the dashboard, and the time would be creeping past 3 a.m. It was always a shock, like I'd lost track of time. But the car was still running. The engine was still purring. And the fumes? They were still seeping in. I'd roll down the window a little bit, but it never seemed to be enough. The air would still feel heavy. And the thing is, I knew it wasn't good. I knew it wasn't the best decision. But it always seemed so harmless at the time. It was just a few more minutes, just a bit more time together. I'd always drop her off safely, make sure she got inside, watch her walk into her house, and then drive home, often exhausted but content. But even then, the thought never crossed my mind that something could have gone horribly wrong. I didn't think about how dangerous it was to have the engine running like that. I didn't think about the carbon monoxide, the risk of suffocation, or the possibility of the exhaust leaking enough to fill the cabin with fumes. I didn't think about how much longer we could have lasted, breathing in that toxic air, getting more and more sleepy until it all went black. It wasn't until a few months ago that it hit me. I was talking to a mate about old cars and how they all have their little quirks, and for some reason, my Civic came up in the conversation. I started thinking about those late-night sessions in the car, how we'd often be there for hours, engine running, windows up. The memory of the fumes creeping in through the holes, how heavy the air would feel, started to make my stomach turn. I was fine with the idea of living dangerously back then. It was part of the thrill, right? Living on the edge. But now, looking back on it, I realize how stupid we were. We could have easily died in that car. I mean, we were sitting there, inhaling all those fumes, breathing in carbon monoxide without a second thought. That's the thing about young love, I guess. You get so caught up in the moment, so wrapped up in each other, that you forget about the real dangers of the world. You forget about the things that can actually kill you. If the engine had stalled, if the exhaust had leaked even more, if the air had gotten thicker, we might have passed out right there in that car. And we wouldn't have even known it. We could have just stayed there, unconscious, suffocating, with no one around to help us. That thought doesn't just make me feel stupid, it scares the hell out of me. How close we came to disaster. How we were so oblivious to it. I don't know if she ever realized how bad it was. I don't think I ever told her. I think I just kept it to myself, assuming I could somehow protect us, that I could control the situation. But I couldn't. We were just lucky. If we hadn't woken up when we did, if I hadn't finally rolled down the windows, if the exhaust hadn't just happened to stop leaking, we could have been done. That's the reality of it. The car, the cold, the late nights, they all combined into something that could have easily killed us. And it wasn't some spooky thing, no supernatural force, no ghostly figure. Just two young people in a broken car, thinking we were invincible. That's why it hit me so hard. It wasn't about some crazy event, some wild accident that made the situation feel real. It was the realization that, in a way, we were already living on borrowed time, taking risks that we never even considered risks. And that's what makes it so terrifying, looking back on it. Not some ghostly figure in the back seat, but the thought that something so simple, so unassuming, could have ended everything. I don't talk about it much. It feels too strange to put into words. But every time I think back on it, I realize just how lucky we were. We could have easily died that winter. And it still makes my heart race when I think about it. I was about 8 or 9 years old when this happened, but I remember it like it was just yesterday. My great-grandmother had passed away not long before, and to be honest, we weren't close. I didn't know her as well as I knew my grandparents, but there was something about her that stuck in my memory. She wasn't a big part of my day-to-day life, but whenever I went to my grandparents' house, she was always there, sitting in her chair, smiling at me, and giving me that thumbs up. I don't know why, but for some reason, that thumbs up always made me smile too. It was like this little unspoken connection between us. Every time I saw it, I'd giggle a little, not out of mockery, but because it just felt nice. It was almost as if she was giving me a little bit of approval without saying anything. It was simple, but to a kid like me, it meant something. My great-grandmother wasn't someone I spent a lot of time with, and I wasn't even sad when she passed away. That might sound harsh, but it's the truth. I just didn't know her well enough to feel the loss in a way that others might have. But one day after school, I found myself thinking about her. Maybe it was because I had just come from my grandparents' house, or maybe it was just the thought of her smile and thumbs up that had stuck with me. Either way, I was walking home, and she was on my mind. I could almost picture her sitting in her chair, smiling that simple smile, and giving me that familiar thumbs up. As I walked home, I thought about that moment in the house when I was younger, just standing in front of her with that awkward smile, feeling a little shy, but also kind of proud of the attention she gave me. I smiled at the memory, remembering how it felt like I had some small, unspoken bond with her, even if it was just a silly little thumbs up. I had no idea why, but thinking about it made me feel warm inside. I reached home, still lost in my thoughts, and ran downstairs to the basement. Our house had this old, creaky staircase that led down to the basement, and for some reason, I liked running down it. I wasn't scared of the dark, and the basement itself didn't feel that spooky, but there was something thrilling about the stairs. The way they creaked under my weight, the way the air smelled down there, a mixture of old books and laundry. It was just a little escape. Maybe it was because I'd spend hours playing with toys or reading in that basement, away from the chaos of the house upstairs. I was halfway down the stairs when it happened. I'm not sure what exactly caused it, but I tripped. 1 second, I was running, and the next, I was losing my balance. My feet slipped out from under me, and for a moment, I thought I was going to fall hard. I remember reaching out instinctively, trying to grab the railing, but I missed. I braced myself for a painful impact. The floor at the bottom of the stairs was hard, and there was a gate blocking the bottom, so I figured I'd hit that first before crashing into the floor. I could already imagine the shock of my body against the cold metal of the gate, but it didn't happen. Instead of hitting the floor hard, I felt my body almost float downwards, like something had cushioned my fall. I didn't hit the gate or the floor with any force. In fact, I didn't really hit anything at all. I landed softly on the ground, the landing feeling almost effortless. My mind was spinning as I tried to process what had just happened. I had tripped, but I hadn't fallen the way I thought I would. There was no pain, no sudden jolt. It was as if my fall had been slowed down by some invisible force. I don't know how long I just lay there, stunned, trying to figure out why I wasn't hurt. It felt strange, like my body had somehow defied gravity, or like the air had softened the impact. But as I lay there, staring up at the ceiling of the basement, my first thought wasn't about how I had fallen or how strange it all was. Instead, it was about my great-grandmother. I thought about her smile and her thumbs up. It was almost as if, in that moment, I could feel her presence, like she had somehow been there, watching over me. Now, I know that sounds weird. I wasn't old enough to understand much about what could or couldn't happen in the world, but I just knew, in that moment, that there was something comforting about it. I don't know why, but I felt like it was her thumbs up, like she had somehow been there to make sure I didn't get hurt. It was one of those strange, unexplainable thoughts that kids sometimes have. Maybe it was just my imagination, but it felt real in that instant. I lay there for a few more seconds, just trying to gather my thoughts, and then I slowly stood up. I didn't hit my head, and my body felt fine. I dusted myself off and climbed back up the stairs, more careful this time. As I reached the top, I felt a little silly for how I'd just stumbled down, but it didn't matter. I was fine, but the feeling that lingered in the back of my mind, the thought of my grandmother giving me that thumbs up, stayed with me as I went about the rest of my day. It was one of those moments you can't quite explain, but you feel it all the same. As I grew older, I often thought back to that moment. I'd tell myself that it was just a coincidence, that I had tripped and somehow avoided injury because of luck or some strange quirk of physics. Maybe it was just a fluke. But there was always a part of me that wondered if there had been something more to it. I've told the story to a few people over the years, and each time, I could see the way they looked at me, sometimes with doubt, sometimes with curiosity. But to me, it wasn't just a fall or a memory. It was a moment that felt significant, like it meant something. I wasn't sure what, but it was something I couldn't quite shake. Looking back, I realized how strange it all was. Maybe I had just wanted to believe that there was something comforting in the world, something that could make me feel safe even when things didn't make sense. Maybe I was just a kid, holding on to something that felt like it mattered. But it stayed with me. The memory of falling and landing softly, of thinking of my great-grandmother and her thumbs up. It was one of those things that became a part of my life story, even if I couldn't fully explain it. It wasn't the kind of event that you'd tell people and expect them to believe, but it didn't matter to me. In that moment, I had felt something. And even now, as an adult, I can't help but think about that day, the way I fell and didn't feel a thing, and the smile and thumbs up I imagined from someone I hardly knew but somehow still felt connected to. Life moves on, and things change. My great-grandmother's house isn't the same anymore. The old stairs, the gate, the basement, all of it is gone. My grandparents have moved away, and that part of my childhood is behind me. But I still carry that memory. It's one of those quiet, almost forgotten moments that still lingers in my mind, a soft reminder of the little things that can make a big impact, even if we don't understand them at the time. I'll never know for sure what happened that day, but I like to think that somehow it was my great-grandmother's way of giving me one last thumbs up. Even if it was just my imagination, it felt real. And maybe that's enough. When I was 7 years old, I thought I understood my world pretty well. My school sat just a block and a half away from my babysitter's house, and most weekdays after the final bell, I'd walk down the sidewalk by myself, my backpack bouncing against my back, full of crayons, workbooks, and whatever treasures I'd collected during the day. I liked the walk. It made me feel grown-up, independent, like I had a little bit of control in a world where I still had to ask permission to go to the bathroom. That day wasn't any different at first. It was a little cloudy, maybe. I remember the light being kind of gray and the wind tugging at my sleeves. I'd left the playground gate and was walking along the sidewalk, one foot after the other, staring at the cracks and skipping the ones with weeds growing out of them. My babysitter lived in one of those small single-story houses with pale yellow siding, just down the road and to the right. I could already see the top of her roof through the bare tree branches when I heard a car slow down behind me. I didn't look right away. Sometimes parents drove past the school, and it was normal to hear tires on the pavement or engines humming by. But the sound didn't go away. It slowed to match my steps, and then a voice barked out from an open window. It was a man's voice, loud and sharp like the crack of a stick breaking in your hands. "Come here. Come here." I froze. I didn't even turn around at first. My hands gripped my backpack straps so tight my fingers went cold. The sidewalk suddenly felt too big and too open. I could feel his eyes on me, like hot pins sticking in my skin. When I finally turned my head just a little, I saw the car, a dented blue sedan, the kind that's supposed to look shiny but hadn't been washed in weeks. The front tire bumped the curb slightly, and the engine rumbled like it was annoyed to be idle. The man inside leaned across the passenger seat, his face half-shadowed. I remember he had a beard, not a big one, but enough to make his chin look darker. His eyes were the part one still can't forget. Wide, like he was scared or desperate, but not in a way that made me feel sorry for him. In a way that made my stomach twist. He didn't look friendly. He didn't look like someone asking for directions. He looked like someone who wanted something I couldn't give him. I shook my head. Just a little. No words came out of my mouth. My throat was too tight. I must have looked like a statue, knees locked, lips pressed together, skin buzzing. And then he said something else. "Stay away from Christina." That was it. No explanation. No warning beyond that. Just those 4 words, like a riddle dropped into my lap. And then the car jerked back into motion, his tires scraping against the curb before rolling off down the street. I stood there for a long time, long enough that a leaf skittered by on the wind and made me flinch. I don't remember walking the rest of the way to the babysitter's house. I must have done it in a daze, because the next clear memory I have is sitting on her couch with a juice box in my hand and cartoons on the TV. But I wasn't watching them. I kept hearing that voice in my head. Stay away from Christina. Over and over again. At the time, it didn't make sense. Christina was one of my friends. Or at least, she was sometimes. She and I had this weird on-again, off-again friendship that little kids have. One day you're best friends sharing snacks. The next day you're not talking because she said your shoes were ugly or you didn't pass her a note fast enough. It didn't feel serious. It just felt like school. There was another girl too. I'll call her Maddie. She was part of our triangle. Sometimes we were all friends. Sometimes two of us would gang up on the other. The usual schoolyard mess. I didn't have any brothers or sisters close to my age, so I didn't have a sense of what was normal or not when it came to other kids. I just went along with it. I never told my babysitter about the man in the car. I should have, but I didn't. I didn't tell my parents either. I think I convinced myself it was just a weird thing that happened, and I didn't want to make a fuss. Maybe part of me was afraid that if I talked about it, he'd come back. I didn't want to hear that voice again. As time passed, I forgot about it. Or at least, I pushed it far enough back in my mind that it didn't come up anymore. Christina and Maddie stayed in my life through 3rd and 4th grade. There were fights and makeups, birthday parties and cold shoulders. I remember once Christina gave me a bracelet made from those stretchy bands, only to rip it off my wrist the next day and say it wasn't for me after all. Another time, Maddie told everyone I cheated on a spelling test, even though I hadn't. I cried in the bathroom while someone kicked the stall door and laughed. Then 2 days later, she asked me to be her partner for a science project. I started to feel like I was always waiting for the next time they'd turn on me, but I still wanted to be liked. That's the worst part about being a kid, when someone's mean to you, and you still want their approval anyway. It's like trying to keep warm in a house with no heat, hoping that maybe if you sit still long enough, the cold won't hurt so much. By 5th grade, things had settled into a weird rhythm. I kept my distance more. I made a couple new friends, but Christina and Maddie still floated around the edges of my day. We were in the same class, which meant we shared the same space, the same routines, the same lunchroom. That day, the one with the pop machine, I remember it was cloudy again. Not stormy, just overcast, like the sun didn't feel like being part of things. Lunch had just started, and we were allowed to use the pop machine in the back hall if we had change. It was a treat. Usually once or twice a week, someone's parent would give them $1 to use it. Maddie came up to me and asked if I wanted to go with her. It seemed harmless. We'd known each other since we were little. We used to share crayons in kindergarten, so I said sure. We walked together down the back hall, our footsteps echoing on the tiles, past the art room and the janitor's closet. The pop machine stood at the end like a glowing prize, humming softly. I put in my coins and got a can of orange soda. Maddie didn't get anything, but she waited while I did, smiling and chatting like we were best friends again. We went back to class. Everyone else was still finishing their lunches, clustered around desks or sitting on the floor. I went to my usual seat and saw Christina standing nearby. She handed me my lunch bag and said something about how people had been messing with my stuff, but she made sure I got it back. She looked proud, like she expected me to thank her. I didn't think too hard about it. I opened my lunch and cracked the soda. The hiss of the can opening was louder than usual. I took one sip. Just one. It didn't taste right. It was sharp and chemical, like floor cleaner. My mouth started to tingle, then burn. I spat it out onto the carpet and dropped the can so fast it rolled under my desk. My tongue felt fuzzy. My eyes watered. I remember getting up and stumbling toward the water fountain in the hallway, not even thinking, just panicking. I rinsed my mouth again and again until I could barely breathe from the cold. Somewhere behind me, I heard voices. A teacher. Someone calling my name. Everything blurred together. The rest of that day was chaos. I was taken to the nurse's office. Then my mom showed up. Then the police. I was questioned, gently at first, then more seriously. Turns out someone had poured Lysol into my soda. Later, I heard it had been Christina and her sister who did it. Not Maddie, though she must have known. The way she smiled when we walked to the machine, the way she didn't get her own drink. It was planned. The school got involved. The police. There were meetings. I didn't go to most of them, but I knew what was being said. My parents got a restraining order against the girls, but the school was too small to enforce any real separation. There was no other class to put them in. Christina got a 4-day suspension. Her sister got 3. After that, they were back in school like nothing had happened. But everything had changed for me. I couldn't sit comfortably in class anymore. I kept my drinks with me. I stopped leaving my lunch unattended. I avoided eye contact. I stopped answering questions, stopped volunteering for anything. My stomach hurt most mornings before school, and I started having trouble sleeping. I'd lie in bed with the covers pulled up to my chin, listening to every creak and gust of wind, half expecting that blue car to show up outside my window again. And the worst part, the part one still think about, all these years later, is that no one really did anything. The teachers whispered about it, but nothing changed. The girls were back in class. They still passed me in the hallway, still sat a few desks away during math, still shared the same playground equipment. Everyone acted like it was a weird blip, something that could be forgotten if you just didn't talk about it. But I couldn't forget, especially not the man in the car. He knew. Somehow he knew. I still don't understand how. I don't know who he was. I never saw him again, not in town, not around the school, not even passing by. Maybe he was someone who knew Christina's family. Maybe he'd seen something. Maybe he was trying to warn me in the only way he knew how. Maybe he thought that if he scared me enough, I'd keep my distance. Maybe that was the point. I don't know. But it wasn't enough. I didn't listen. I didn't stay away. I kept trying to be accepted. I kept walking into the same mess, hoping it wouldn't hurt this time. It took a long time for me to stop blaming myself. For not running. For not telling anyone sooner. For wanting to belong so badly that I didn't see what was right in front of me. Now I'm older, and I look back on that time with a mix of anger and sorrow. Not just for what happened, but for how small I was. How little power I had. How no one seemed to take it seriously until it was almost too late. I don't drink orange soda anymore. I don't like Lysol. The smell makes my chest go tight. I still have dreams sometimes about being frozen on that sidewalk, the blue car idling. It was around 1:30 in the morning, maybe closer to 2. I'd lost track of time again. My eyes felt dry from staring at my computer screen too long, and the blue light had started to make everything in my room feel a little surreal. I was halfway through a long project that I'd been putting off all week, but I finally had the energy to make progress, and I didn't want to stop. I'd thrown on some headphones a few hours earlier to stay focused, so everything outside the soft, steady click of my keyboard was blocked out. The house was totally quiet, no surprise this late. The only sound besides the keys tapping was the low hum of the desktop fan I had pointed at me to keep the heat from getting uncomfortable. I was staying at my aunt and uncle's house again. I stayed here every summer for a few weeks, sometimes longer, usually around the same time each year. It was like a second home by now, and I knew every creaky floorboard, every light switch, every weird little noise the house made when it settled. It was a one-story ranch-style house, pretty long in layout. My room was at the far end of the hall, tucked into the corner of the house next to the laundry room. To get to the bathroom, I had to leave my room, turn left, go a few steps, turn left again, walk down a narrow hallway, and then the bathroom was on the left side about halfway down. I'd done that exact path in the dark hundreds of times. I'd been holding in a pee for over an hour, too focused on work to bother getting up. But eventually, it hit the point where it was impossible to ignore. I pulled off my headphones, and the sudden quiet felt loud. The silence of the house pressed in around me. No TV murmuring in the living room. No footsteps upstairs, because there was no upstairs. Everyone was asleep. The lights were off everywhere except my room, and even that was just the glow of my monitor. I stood up, stretched, cracked my neck, and then cracked my back, blinking a few times before opening the door slowly. I instinctively kept the handle turned, so it wouldn't click loudly when it shut behind me. The hallway was pitch black. No light at all. My room had a little light spill, but once I stepped out, it vanished behind the door when I eased it shut. I didn't turn on the hallway light. I didn't need it. I knew this path. It was burned into my brain. Even when I was younger and afraid of the dark, I could do this walk without thinking. I took a few slow, careful steps forward. My socked feet didn't make any noise on the wood floor. I found the first left turn easily. The corner of the wall was familiar against the backs of my fingers. I walked forward a few steps. The second left came right on cue. I always counted steps out of habit, something I'd picked up years ago. 4 steps to the first turn, 6 more to the second. From there, it was a straight shot to the bathroom. When I got there, I turned on the bathroom light quickly, closing the door behind me so it wouldn't wake anyone else. The sudden brightness made me squint a little. It was just a normal bathroom, beige tiles, a plain mirror, a stack of neatly folded towels, and the same faded rug that had been there for years. I did my business, washed my hands, and stared at myself for a second in the mirror. I looked tired. My eyes were slightly bloodshot, my hair sticking out in weird directions. I ran a hand down my face and turned the light off again, plunging myself back into darkness. I stood in the dark for a second, letting my eyes adjust. I didn't want to walk straight into a wall or knock something over. I knew the way back just as well as the way there, just reversed. From the bathroom door, I turned right, took a few careful steps, and turned right again. Now I was headed toward my room. Total silence. No creaking. Just me and the blackness. But then something felt off. It was subtle at first. I took a few steps forward and felt the sensation of being watched. You know the feeling, that weird tickle at the base of your neck like someone's eyes are on you. I froze. I stood completely still, holding my breath, trying to listen. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Maybe someone else up? Maybe the dog had gotten out of my cousin's room? But there was nothing. No footsteps. No breathing. Just silence. I told myself I was being stupid. Just tired. I started moving again, feeling the wall to my right with my fingertips, counting my steps like always. I was halfway back to my room when I saw it, or thought I saw it. A movement, a shift in the dark. It was quick, too fast for me to make out, but I was sure I'd seen something move across the hallway, like a shadow flickering from one side to the other. I stopped again. My breathing got shallow. I reached out with my hand, keeping it against the wall like a lifeline. The hallway hadn't changed. I was still on track, still heading the right way, but I felt my heart start to pound just a little faster. I stood there for what felt like a full minute, straining my ears, trying to hear anything. The blood rushing through my ears made it hard to focus. I waited just in case. Nothing. Dead silence. My legs felt tense, but I took another slow step forward. That's when I saw it again. It moved differently this time. It didn't flicker across the hallway. It came at me. I swear to God something came out of the dark, directly from where my room should be. A vague shape, tall, just slightly darker than the rest of the hallway, like the outline of a person moving quickly toward me. It didn't make a sound. It didn't hesitate. It came fast and then just stopped, right in front of me. I couldn't breathe. I was frozen. I couldn't even scream if I wanted to. I stood there, one hand still on the wall, the other just hanging useless at my side, inches away from this thing that had no face, no eyes, no shape I could understand. It was just there, right in front of me, close enough that if I'd raised my hand, I could have touched it. But I didn't move. I was too afraid. I closed my eyes tight, then opened them again. I tried to focus, tried to blink the shape into something real, something solid that I could explain. But it didn't go away. I reached out finally, hand shaking, and found something solid. Cold, smooth, and my nose bumped into it. A loud snort came out of me, half fear, half confused relief. It was the mirror. The hallway mirror that hung on the wall at a 90-degree angle next to my bedroom door. I hadn't made my second right turn. I was standing halfway down the wrong stretch of hallway, and I was staring at my own reflection, half seen in the dark. My body slumped with a kind of weird mix of exhaustion and laughter. I almost laughed, but I didn't want to wake anyone. I just let out this deep, shaky breath and stood there for another minute, letting my heart calm down. My chest still felt tight, but I was starting to feel the embarrassment creep in now, replacing the fear. The house layout made total sense once I stopped and thought. The hallway went down and split near the end. One side led to my room, the other looped back toward the living room. I'd misjudged the turn, gone too far, and instead of turning right toward my room, I went straight, where the hallway opened slightly and where the mirror hung. The mirror wasn't big, maybe chest height, wide enough to reflect a person. I'd forgotten it was there because I never paid attention to it. It had been hung there decades ago, probably by my grandparents, and now it was just part of the wall. But tonight, in the dark, when I was already on edge, seeing my own shadowy reflection moving toward me felt like something out of a nightmare. I'd scared myself. Completely and utterly scared myself with nothing but a mirror and the dark and my own tired brain. After catching my breath, I slowly turned around and retraced my steps. This time I counted carefully. For steps, then the turn. I finally found the right hallway and the familiar door to my room. I reached out, touched the handle, and this time there was no shadow, no reflection, no weird shape. Just my room, faintly lit by the glow of my monitor, waiting quietly. I stepped inside, shut the door gently behind me, and let out one more deep breath. My hands were still shaking a little, and I felt this weird cold sweat on the back of my neck. My chair was still slightly warm from where I'd been sitting earlier. I sat back down, put my headphones off to the side this time, and stared at my screen. For a few minutes, I didn't type anything. I didn't work. I just sat there, going over what had happened again and again. And every time, the same realization hit me. I'd gotten scared of myself. Of my own shadow in a mirror I'd forgotten was there. That was it. That was all. But in the moment, it felt real. So real that it hijacked everything in my body. My logic, my instincts, my breathing, my focus. It all vanished under that wave of pure panic. And I hadn't heard a sound. It was all sight, flickers, movement, shapes my brain couldn't process in the dark. Just long enough for fear to creep in and take control. I eventually leaned back in my chair and looked around my room. The fan was still humming. The stack of books on the dresser hadn't moved. My bag was still open, spilling clothes onto the floor. Nothing had changed. The house was just as quiet as before. But I knew I wasn't going to forget that moment anytime soon. It reminded me of when I was a kid and used to lie in bed at night, convinced that someone was standing at the foot of my bed, even though I couldn't see them. Just like back then, tonight had been all in my head. No ghosts, no monsters, no intruders. Just bad lighting and a mirror in the wrong place. I stayed up for another hour, not really doing anything. Just kind of scrolling through old emails, watching the clock tick. I didn't want to admit it, but I was still a little afraid of the hallway. I didn't want to walk through it again tonight. Eventually, I turned everything off, pulled the covers up tight, and tried to sleep. But that mirror stuck with me. The way my own reflection moved, just slow enough to look like something else. It made me realize how little it takes to scare yourself.